Chapter 908. Those existences in the Tao integration realm were not inferior to Luo Fan in terms of strength and cultivation realm. Even though Luo Fan's cultivation system came from the Tianyuan universe, which was more complete than the cultivation system of the Earth universe, he would be able to exert the power of the Tao integration realm more than the cultivators in the intermediate tier of the Sage-to-Be realm in the Earth universe. However, it was impossible for him to wipe out the real body and two corpses of an existence at the peak of the Tao integration realm from hundreds of millions of light-years away. The reason for this was that these existences at the Tao integration realm were no different from the real existences at the peak of the Tao integration realm in terms of strength and cultivation realm. However, the essence of their existence was, after all, just a projection. It was a projection formed by the bridge of time through some unimaginable method. No matter how powerful this kind of projection was, no matter how many grudges it had with someone, there would definitely be some differences between it and a real existence. With the help of the subtle mysteries that he had comprehended from the sage's projection, Luo Fan could even see through the projection of the primordial era and the truth of the 9,999 checkpoints in a short time. Even the projection of an existence at the peak of the Tao integration realm could not pose much of an obstacle to him. With just a thought, he saw through the foundation of his existence in the projection of this era. What he had done just now was to destroy the foundation of that existence. In this way, the powerful existence at the peak of the Sage-to-Be realm, who had cut off the two corpses, was instantly destroyed and turned into powder. When that existence was destroyed, the power around it lost control and exploded, causing the planet it was on to explode. That was why such an earth-shattering explosion had occurred. After doing all this, Luo Fan's thoughts moved and he raised his eyes to look at the void. His eyes directly penetrated all the rules and principles, as well as the void behind the rules and principles. Among the strange existences that were as boundless as the Great Way and seemed to fill the entire void of the universe for hundreds of millions of light-years, they seemed insignificant and could be directly ignored. He directly saw countless spacetimes. These spacetimes varied in size, and the time they existed varied in length. Some spacetimes were created and destroyed so quickly that even Luo Fan could not see the interval between their creation and destruction. However, some spacetimes always existed, as if they would never change. In that spacetime there was practically nothingness. Not even the laws and laws existed. There wasn't even time or space. Only a very, very small number of them had some strange substances within them. Within it, there was a space-time filled with a strange light. There was no way to describe the color of that light. Anyone who saw that light would only feel that it was the most primordial source of the universe. It was the closest kind of light to nothingness. Seeing this light and feeling the initial charm within it, Luo Fan instantly calmed down. That light was what he was looking for. That space and time was his ultimate goal in coming to the primordial era. It was the space and time where the will of the world was projected in the primordial era. "I've finally found it." Luo Fan let out a long sigh of relief and a faint smile appeared on his face. At that moment, he could sense the entire universe and the entire world very clearly. It was so clear that he even felt that he could cause the world to flip and collapse with just a single thought. He raised his head and looked into the void. In a trance, his eyes penetrated countless obstacles and saw a major thousand world in Earth's universe. It was his main body, who was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, sensing the chaos and adjusting his view of the world. At that moment, Luo Fan's main body suddenly opened his eyes and looked into the void. At that moment, a mysterious feeling arose in his heart. The endless mysteries of the world and the truths of the universe were directly integrated into the depths of his soul without him having to comprehend them. His cultivation realm started to rise at an unimaginable speed. Millions of years had passed in Earth's universe since the last time he had contacted his clone who had stepped onto the bridge of times. During this time, he had used the cultivation realm of the void comprehending state that he had obtained from his clone to sort out his incomplete view of the world and compare it with the state of chaos in order to find the mistakes in his view of the world. Over millions of years, he had naturally made great progress. Although he still hadn't completed his view of the world, it was much better than before. This made his cultivation realm more stable than before, and his foundation had become more solid. However, because he had wholeheartedly focused on adjusting his view of the world, his cultivation realm had still barely reached the initial success stage. Compared to his initial achievement, it was much better. However, compared to his clone, it was still worlds apart. At that moment, his cultivation realm started to rise by leaps and bounds. In the blink of an eye, he broke through the initial success stage and reached the great success stage. In the blink of an eye, he broke through the great success stage and reached the perfection stage. Following that, he broke through the perfection stage and reached the Tao integration stage. In the short span of a few breaths, he had crossed the cultivation barrier that would have taken him tens of thousands of years or even hundreds of millions of years to cross. He had achieved an unbelievable cultivation realm and reached the Tao integration stage. This was a stage that was equivalent to a demi-saint who had cut off the second separation in Earth's universe. Even with the accumulation of millions of years, such a speed was absolutely unimaginable. When Luo Fan's main body reached the Tao integration stage, the world that his eyes saw was the same as the world that his clone had seen. It had undergone an earth-shattering change. Similarly, he had directly penetrated the barriers of the infinite rules and laws, penetrated the infinite nothingness behind the rules and laws, and saw the hidden strange existence that seemed to be infinitely vast and filled the entire Earth's universe. However, it also seemed infinitely narrow and small, so small that it could be completely ignored. This existence seemed to exist in the unseen world, as if it encompassed infinite spacetime, and there were also countless beings that were constantly being born and destroyed in the spacetime. A feeling of becoming one with the great Tao arose spontaneously, and the entire Earth's universe seemed to have no secrets from him at this moment. Everything that was happening within an unknown number of millions of light years in the Earth's universe appeared in his mind at this moment. Of course, it did not mean that it was infinite. The closer the region was to where he was, the more detailed he could feel everything. The further the region was from where he was, the more vague the feeling was. However, no matter how vague it was, as long as it was happening in the Earth's universe, no matter how many millions of light years it was away, he could still sense it. He could roughly know what was happening there. Under such circumstances, he only had to issue a command in his heart to instantly find out how many cultivators at the innate golden immortal realm or above were in this universe, and he knew where the worlds they'd established were. It was even to the extent that he could faintly sense exactly how formidable they were. I didn't expect there to be more than 10 demi-saints in this Dharma-ending age. Moreover, there are actually tens of thousands of connate zenith heaven realm cultivators. Could this be the so-called final radiance of the setting sun? Luo Fan could not help but sigh emotionally when he understood all that. He could sense that the cultivation world of the Earth's universe was more prosperous than he had imagined. The most powerful cultivators were not just connate zenith heaven realm cultivators, but demi-saints, or, according to the classification of realms in the great primordial heaven realm, they were above the 9 immortal realms, existences above the perishment realm. Among them, the strongest had even reached the half-transcendent realm. In other words, it was equivalent to severing 2 corpses and comprehending the third corpse, but for various reasons, they could not sever it. Apart from that half-transcendent realm existence, there were 3 other demi-saints who had severed 2 corpses. As for the others, apart from the 3 who had not severed their corpses due to various reasons, all of them had severed 1 corpse. Apart from that, among the tens of thousands of connate zenith heaven realm cultivators, there were even a few hundred who had reached the limits of connate zenith heaven realm and would break through in the next instant. It was not surprising to Luo Fan that they had stepped into the demi-saint realm. Just like that, there were tens of thousands of connate zenith heaven realm cultivators and dozens of demi-saint. Not even the most prosperous era of cultivation in the primordial world could compare to this. This was the complete opposite of the age of Dharma ending that the Earth's universe was currently in. Luo Fan could not help but sigh emotionally. However, he could actually guess the reason behind it. Before the age of Dharma ending, the Earth's universe was the age of cultivation. Before the age of cultivation, it was the age of sages. Among them, the sages who had destroyed the world before the primordial era had, for some unknown reason, reappeared in this universe after countless billions of years of oblivion. They once again preached their Tao, and this naturally created an even more prosperous cultivation civilization. Although the age of Dharma ending was 2 eras away from the age of sages, it was only the beginning of the age of sages. It was only slightly more than 5 billion years before the age of sages. With such a long period of time, it was impossible for the remaining cultivation civilization to be completely wiped out. It made sense that there were so many demi-saints and connate zenith heaven realm cultivators. Of course, regardless of whether it made sense or not, the appearance of so many demi-saints and connate zenith heaven realm cultivators in the age of Dharma ending would definitely be related to the final radiance of the setting sun. Fortunately, the heavenly fire Taoist and the others were only mid-level connate zenith heaven realm cultivators. If they were at the top, the 5 stages before the sage realm, that I've told them would just be displaying one's slight skill before an expert. Luo Fan felt slightly fortunate after sensing it for a while. Back then, Luo Fan said that the Earth's universe only divided the realms before the sage realm into 4 stages, and directly removed the demi-saint realm. This understanding was clearly wrong. If any of the heavenly fire Taoist and the others knew what the demi-saint realm was, Luo Fan would probably be embarrassed. Fortunately, even the strongest connate zenith heaven realm cultivator among them was only equivalent to the 8th stage of the immortal realm. There was still a long way to go before they reached the 9th stage of the immortal realm. Even Old Man Omniscient, who claimed to know everything, did not know what the demi-saint realm was, which allowed Luo Fan to keep his face. It seems that the Earth's universe is full of crouching tigers and hidden dragons, but we can't take them lightly. Luo Fan finally came to a conclusion and completely put this matter aside. His gaze turned to the Tao integration realm, which could only be seen after attaining the Tao integration realm. It was like the Great Way, which seemed to fill the universe and seemed to have shrunk to the point of being invisible. Above that existence, there were also countless changes of time and space. However, these changes of time and space were hundreds of millions of times more complicated than that of the era projection. With Luo Fan's eyesight, he couldn't even see the evolution of any of the spacetime. The spacetime seemed to be born and destroyed at the same time, but he couldn't lock onto a fixed spacetime at all. Each spacetime was changing its position in accordance with some incomparably complicated and mysterious method in that bizarre existence that seemed like the Great Tao. However, although he could not lock onto those time and space and could not see the truth, he could easily find out with his perception. None of these time and space had the will of heaven and earth like the era projection. This made Luo Fan feel disappointed, but also reasonable. The Earth's universe was the real Earth's universe at this time, and the Dharma ending age was also the real Dharma ending age. The will of heaven and earth of this era was naturally much more powerful and vast than that of the era projection. The mystery contained in it could only be understood by those who had reached the sage realm. How could it be easily discovered by the Tao integration realm? Previously, he had searched for the will of heaven and earth because he had hoped to get lucky and see if a miracle would happen. After seeing this, He shifted his gaze and looked through the void of the Earth's universe, passing through the endless laws and laws in another direction. This direction was not a position, but an extremely mysterious concept that could not be described in words. He went deep into it and passed through many obstacles in the blink of an eye. He broke through the nothingness and saw the boundless and boundless state of chaos where time, space, matter, and energy were all mixed together in an indescribable way. At this moment, the state of chaos that he saw was many times clearer than when he had become a void-comprehending expert, and the range that he could sense was also much larger than before. Moreover, it was no longer as difficult as before. In fact, he had a feeling that he could even break through the layers of barriers. He could introduce the state of chaos into the Earth's universe. Of course, he was just thinking about it. Based on his various comprehensions over the past millions of years, if even a trace of this state of chaos were to enter the Earth's universe, it would be enough to cause a shocking upheaval. It would be enough to cause the void within a range of tens of thousands of light-years to collapse and turn into a shocking chaos similar to the state of chaos. Unless he had absolute confidence that he could seal the state of chaos that had been introduced. Otherwise, if he were to introduce even a trace of the state of chaos into the Earth's universe, it would be a disaster. It could even be considered a form of suicide. The shocking upheaval caused by the state of chaos was extremely terrifying to him and was enough to threaten his life. As for the state of chaos, if even a trace of it were to land on him, he could only wait for death unless a sage stepped in to save him. Therefore, although he had the vague ability to introduce the state of chaos into the Earth's universe, Luo Fan let it go after sensing it slightly. With a slight thought, the worldview that he had reorganized over the years appeared once again, and he began a new round of comparison with the state of chaos. Because the range of the state of chaos that he sensed was much wider and clearer than before, he had to redo all his previous gains. Many of the conclusions that he had confirmed previously had to be verified again. Fortunately, the countless wrong conclusions that he had eliminated during the process of comparison over millions of years were still wrong and did not need to be redone. However, it was not considered a waste of effort. Just as he was doing this, the power in his body started to surge. His spirit, his will, his senses, the toughness of his body, and his fruits of the way all started to undergo drastic changes. The speed of the transformation from the void comprehending stage to the path integration stage was extremely fast. At almost every moment, he would become several times or even several dozen times stronger than before. However, none of this could attract his attention. All of his attention and thoughts were focused on the chaotic state and his view of the world. He did not care about any changes in his body at all. He did not care about how mysterious and unbelievable everything that was happening to his body at this moment was. Inside the era bridge, the projection of the primordial era, Luo Fan merely smiled as he watched the various actions of his main body. That was his main body. Everything that he did and thought was the same as him. Naturally, he was not surprised by the choice that his main body had made. He withdrew his gaze and turned to look at the incomparably mysterious shadow of the sage in front of him. This shadow was still the same as when he had first seen it. There was not the slightest bit of change. Unfortunately, it's just a projection. Looking at the shadow of the sage, Luo Fan saw much more than before. He discovered the truth of the shadow of the sage that he had not discovered before. This shadow of the sage was the same as the quasi-sages who had severed the second corpse. It was also just a projection and also had the same weakness as the quasi-sages who had severed the second corpse. In other words, if Luo Fan wanted to, he could also completely destroy the shadow of the sage with a single grab. Even if the shadow of the sage still contained countless unimaginable mysteries that would bring him endless benefits, it would still be the same. Such a projection possessed many of the mysteries of the shadow of the sage, but it could not possibly possess all of them. Moreover, because it was just a projection, if Luo Fan destroyed the projection of the primordial era, the shadow of the sage would also disappear. However, with Luo Fan's current realm, it was obviously impossible for him to completely comprehend the various mysteries within. This meant that Luo Fan only had two choices. One was to work hard to comprehend the mysteries here, no matter what the checkpoint was, no matter how long it took. The other, he could ignore the shadow of the sage and directly destroy the projection of the primordial era, using the fastest time to pass the 9,999 obstacles. Chapter 909. It was so cool to watch it without advertisements. Looking at the sage's shadow, Luo Fan frowned. After a while, he finally made up his mind. It was obviously impossible to get all the benefits. For Luo Fan, the sage's shadow in front of him was mysterious and unpredictable. It contained enough mysteries for him to reach the supreme realm. If he could fully comprehend it, it would not be unbelievable for him to break through to the Tao integration, or even transcend and become a Tao master. However, there was a precondition for this, and that was that he had sufficient time and ability to comprehend the various profundities within it. At this moment, whether it was in terms of time or ability, he was lacking to a certain extent. If the sage's shadow was real, he could think of various ways to take it away so that he could comprehend the mysteries in the future when he had enough time or ability. However, it was obvious that the sage's shadow was only a projection of the era bridge. It was just a part of the projection of the primordial era. Its fundamental nature was just a projection. No matter where it was, it would disappear as long as the projection of the primordial era was destroyed. Unless Luo Fan had the ability to combine the era bridge and the era vortex, he could change the basis of its existence and make the projection of the sage's shadow be based on him. Then, it would be possible to preserve the projection of the sage's shadow. Obviously, if Luo Fan had such an ability, why would he need the sage's shadow? He could easily project things that existed billions of years ago, and he could break through the era to retrieve things that existed billions of years ago. His cultivation realm had probably reached the saint realm long ago. His own shadow was the sage's shadow. Why would he need to project it? After all these thoughts flashed through his mind, how could Luo Fan not know what to do? He sat down cross-legged and projected his perception out of his body. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of kinds of power instantly rushed out of his palm. A colorless and transparent strange light condensed in the void. Although this strange light looked the same as before he reached the Tao integration, in fact, its nature was more mysterious. The combination of the power was more subtle and exquisite. It was even more mysterious. This combination of power combined with his perception and instantly condensed to form a willpower with perception as its core. This willpower was many times more tenacious than the willpower he had condensed before he reached the Tao integration realm. It floated there, emitting an eternal and unmoving aura that could not be worn down by all tribulations. Anyone who sensed the profoundness of it would be able to easily discover how terrifying the might of that will was. This existence was constructed with Luo Fan's perception as its core. When Luo Fan's perception was at the void comprehension realm, this willpower was naturally at the void comprehension realm. At this moment, Luo Fan's perception was already at the level of the Tao integration realm. His willpower had naturally risen along with it, and it was equivalent to the willpower of a Tao integration realm cultivator. After this willpower was formed, Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes. Under the control of his thoughts, the willpower slowly sank into the projection of the sage's shadow below. In an instant, a supreme, powerful, and noble thought instantly integrated into that willpower and was transmitted into Luo Fan's mind through the perception of that willpower, causing Luo Fan to almost instantly sink into that thought. He was unable to extricate himself. Fortunately, just like before, because it was separated by perception, this kind of thought only occupied a small part of his mind. Although it was supreme, powerful, and noble, and even made him look down on everything, seeing his own existence as an ant and disdainful. It was directly suppressed by his own will, as if it had frozen. Although it was still wreaking havoc in his mind, it was unable to truly affect his state of mind. As he looked down at this thought, Luo Fan suddenly discovered that it was somewhat different from before. This difference was so subtle that he could not clearly tell what kind of change it was. If he had to describe it, it was as if the distortion of the true way of thinking had become less strong than before. In other words, compared to the way of thinking that he had sensed in his mind before, the way of thinking that appeared in his mind at this moment was much closer to the mental projection that was contained in the real saint's shadow, which was a trace of remnant will. Of course, even though it was close, it had still gone through a huge distortion. He could only vaguely see the characteristics of the sage's mental projection, but he could not really tell what was going on with the sage's thinking. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he was obviously quite satisfied with this situation. Based on the degree of distortion of this way of thinking, it was easy to see that Luo Fan had made great progress after becoming a Tao integration cultivator. Although he still could not understand the way of thinking of the sage, he was much stronger than before and was vaguely approaching that way of thinking. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, he directly cleared all kinds of distracting thoughts and carefully comprehended the mysteries contained in the way of thinking. At this moment, compared to the past, he had evolved from the primitive era to the era of slaves. Naturally, he still did not understand most of the mysteries contained in the various ways of thinking. However, he had made some progress after all, and he understood a little more than before. After an unknown period of time, it felt like an instant but also like hundreds of millions of years. In a trance, two extremely huge and extremely complicated patterns suddenly appeared in his mind, directly understanding everything in his mind. Even the perception that was connected to the sage's shadow was instantly cut off due to the shock caused by the appearance of the two patterns, causing him to completely lose his sense of the sage's shadow. The way of thinking that was transmitted to him due to his perception was instantly wiped clean, as if it did not exist at all. All that was left in his mind were those two extremely complicated patterns. Among the two patterns, one of them was extremely similar to the pattern that had allowed him to break through the perfected void-comprehending realm and become a Tao integration cultivator. However, it was more exquisite and complicated than that pattern. Obviously, that pattern had been created after his cultivation realm had improved. He had obtained a new understanding, which made the pattern more complete and mysterious. As for the other pattern, it was something that had never appeared before. It was completely different from the previous pattern, but regardless of its complexity or profoundness, it was not inferior to the previous pattern at all. These two patterns radiated boundless brilliance in his mind and will. Every pattern was like a sun that illuminated his mind in a scorching manner. It then spread out and engulfed his perception, his spirit, his will, his body, and his power. Under the scorching light, wisps of strange black mist appeared all over Luo Fan's body. As soon as the black mist appeared, it frantically condensed in the void and turned into countless demonic shadows that struggled and roared frantically as if they had spiritual intelligence. During this process, Luo Fan's body, will, spirit, perception, and power all improved at an unimaginable speed. In the blink of an eye, he had already reached the peak of the Tao integration realm and was only one step away from breaking through and achieving the initial success. During this process, Luo Fan only felt indescribable pain from every part of his body. His power, perception, will, and spirit swept over, almost causing him to fall into a coma. Fortunately, his will was firm. Although it was extremely painful, he still managed to maintain his consciousness and did not fall into a coma. As expected, I'm still far from being able to fully comprehend the mysteries of this saint's shadow. I've only comprehended a little bit, but the violent increase in power almost made me collapse. Luo Fan was drenched in sweat and thought to himself with an extremely pale face. At this moment, the two balls had already shrunk into a ball in a corner of his mind. They were like two round golden cores that floated in the air without moving. The light that they gave off had also been completely withdrawn, and there was no longer any power that could be seen. He looked up at the countless howling demonic shadows that were trying their best to pounce on him. They collided with his body and wanted to return to his body. However, no matter how hard they tried, they collapsed the moment they collided with Luo Fan's body. Only by dispersing could they condense into demonic shadows again. I didn't expect these impurities to be expelled in such a domineering manner. Luo Fan observed these demonic shadows carefully and smiled bitterly to himself. He raised his hand and grabbed at the void. These demonic shadows let out miserable shrieks and were directly annihilated into nothingness. These demonic shadows were condensed from the various impurities in Luo Fan's body. The combination included the impurities of his physical body, his power, his perception, his will, his mind, his spirit, and so on. It covered every single existence in his body. Luo Fan was now at the Tao integration realm. According to the realms before the primordial era in the Earth's universe, this cultivation realm was equivalent to a mid-tier quasi-saint. In other words, a quasi-saint who had already severed two corpses. For such a powerful existence, any power that he released would naturally have a brand new spiritual intelligence and turn into an incomparably complete power-living being as long as the restrictions were completely lifted. Even Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivators had such characteristics, let alone Tao Integration Realm cultivators who were tens of thousands of times more powerful than Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivators. This kind of power could only be stronger, not weaker. Clearly, the various impurities that had left Luo Fan's body due to the violent expulsion of the two images contained the characteristics of a Tao Integration Realm cultivator, even though they were impurities. Since they were impurities, after being expelled, Luo Fan naturally could not be reluctant to leave them. Naturally, he gave up control over them. Under such circumstances, how could these impurities not condense into living beings? As for why they were demon shadows, it was naturally because their essence was still impurities. They were instinctively detested by Luo Fan, so the living beings' wills that were formed naturally looked like this. After destroying the demon shadows formed by countless impurities, Luo Fan sighed. He knew that unless he made another breakthrough in his cultivation realm, it would be impossible for him to continue gaining anything from the projection of the sage's shadow. With a thought, he took a step forward. He did not care what the sage's shadow was like, nor did he care about the formation that he had set up to isolate the sage's shadow from the outside world. His figure directly stepped into the void. He headed towards the space-time where the projection of the world's will from the primordial era was located. Just as he entered the void and was about to step into that space-time, there was suddenly a peerlessly powerful force that gathered hundreds of millions of light-years away. It directly shot out with him as its target and instantly arrived above his head, crashing down on him. In the blink of an eye, it was about to touch his body. Luo Fan's mind moved slightly, and in an instant, he discovered the source of this power, as well as the identity of the person who released this power. He also found the reason why that person had released this power. He raised his hand and slapped it gently. He did not directly come into contact with that power. Instead, he directly blasted it in the air. Although he blasted it in the air, however, the effect it produced was incomparably shocking. With just this blast, the power that was attacking him, which could completely wipe out all Tao Integration Realm cultivators, instantly collapsed and turned into a gust of spring wind that swept in all directions. It even affected the void within a radius of several light-years. Faced with such an attack, Luo Fan stopped his plan to continue stepping into the space-time where the projection of the world's will was located. He took a step forward and returned to the primordial era's projection. It's not simple indeed. It seems like you've already grasped the truth of this destroyed universe. No wonder you were able to kill fellow Taoist Ping Long so easily. A leisurely sigh entered Luo Fan's ears. Then, two figures traversed the void and appeared in front of Luo Fan. They were a man and a woman. They were two of the few Tao integration realm existences in the primordial era's projection that Luo Fan had sensed back then. At that moment, the two of them were floating in the void of the universe. There was a celebratory cloud that was dozens of acres above their heads. On the celebratory cloud, there were two figures that looked very similar to them, but their auras were completely different. There were also several strange Dharma treasures floating in the celebratory cloud. How do I address the two of you? What's your relationship with Taoist Ping Long? Asked Luo Fan with a smile. The man among the two looked simple and unadorned, and he was middle-aged. He exuded a faint killing intent, but his tone was very calm as he said, "I'm Fong Jing and she's Fairy Jing. We're both best friends of fellow Taoist Ping Long, I see. No wonder you're looking for trouble with me." Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. It had been a few days since he had become a Tao integration expert. Back when he had become a Tao integration expert, he had killed a quasi-sage who was billions of light-years away in order to test his supernormal ability. The quasi-sage's good friend had deduced his location over the past few days, so it was only natural for him to seek revenge for the quasi-sage. The two of you are similar to Taoist Ping Long, yet I killed him so easily. Are you confident that you can defeat me? Asked Luo Fan. Regardless of whether we can or not, we have to give it a try. It was still the man who spoke. The woman had been calm and indifferent ever since she had appeared. Her expression did not change at all, as if nothing had anything to do with her. Could it be that your confidence comes from that connate numinous treasure? Luo Fan asked with a smile as he raised his hand and pointed at a mirror-like Dharma treasure on the celebratory cloud above the man's head. Huh! The Taoist's expression changed slightly when he heard Luo Fan's words. Do it! The woman suddenly spat out these two words. As soon as she said those two words, the two figures on the cloud above the man's head began to move, each emitting a profound and boundless power. Each of them was comparable to the power that had attacked Luo Fan just now and bombarded the mirror-like magic treasure. The Dharma treasure floated in the air and emitted billions of tiny lights in the void after it was blasted. After the billions of tiny lights left the mirror, they hid in the void. As the billions of tiny lights hid, the void within a radius of several light-years left the primordial projection and formed a brand-new independent space-time that Luo Fan had never seen before. In this space-time, Luo Fan only felt an indescribable pressure coming at him from all directions. It directly locked onto him and suppressed him, making it difficult for him to even move his body. He felt that he couldn't even blink or move his muscles. Then, the woman and the two figures on the celebratory cloud above her raised their hands and pointed at Luo Fan. Luo Fan felt an indescribable splitting force acting on him, making him feel like his entire body was slowly collapsing. It was as if a supreme power was erasing him from the very roots. The feeling of his body collapsing and being destroyed made him feel a sense of danger, as if his life was fading away. If you're really in your true forms and not projections, I'm afraid I'll be in danger. Even at this moment, Luo Fan could still laugh. True forms? I had a strange feeling before, as if the essence of my existence was somewhat illusory. It seems like we're really just projections. The man did not react like a normal living being when he heard Luo Fan's words. Instead, he spoke very calmly. So you can feel it? That's right. At our level, we can already see through what's real and what's fake. No matter how real this world is, it can't be hidden from us. It's only natural that you can see through it. Luo Fan was puzzled at first, but then he came to a sudden realization. However, since you know that you're projections, why are you risking your life for the friendship that your main body's left behind? Luo Fan asked curiously. If you like this work, You are welcome to cast a recommendation vote or monthly vote. L. For the latest and fastest chapters, please go to Reading is a Pleasure. I suggest you collect. Chapter 9-10. What's the difference between projection and reality? Perhaps our friendship with fellow Taoist Ping Long is only a memory from our main body. However, to us who are projections, those memories are everything to us. The friendship in those memories is naturally our friendship. The middle-aged Taoist's expression was still calm as he spoke. At this moment, Luo Fan's body had almost reached its limit. It was as if he would collapse in the next moment and turn into dust. However, this did not affect his thoughts in the slightest. Furthermore, he did not panic at all. He simply floated there quietly, allowing the various powers to wreak havoc on his body. So that's the case. As expected of intermediate quasi-sages. If not for the fundamental conflict between us, I would have befriended you. What a pity. Luo Fan sighed. The man and woman did not reply to Luo Fan. They only hovered there quietly, and their expressions were rather startled. It seemed to be a pity, but also a sense of loss. Luo Fan didn't waste any more time talking to them. After expressing his pity, his mind moved slightly, and the power in his body turned into a clear brilliance. It directly shot out from the acupuncture points of his body and instantly hit a place in the void. Following his attack, whether it was the surrounding space that had been split apart or the endless power that had engulfed his entire body and was about to turn him into dust, they all collapsed in an instant. They had completely lost control of their will, and were unable to condense into any form to cause any damage to Luo Fan. With just a light blast, Luo Fan had broken away from the unstoppable combination attack of the man and woman. In fact, he even seemed to be unscathed and was still in peak condition. This fact caused their pupils to instantly contract, and the expressions on their faces to become extremely stiff. After a long while, the expressions of the two of them slowly recovered. They looked at each other and could not help but smile bitterly. It seems. His ability is not just to grasp the truth of this universe, but also to grasp the common weakness of projections like us. Utmost stillness, it seems like we are finally going to vanish together. The middle-aged Taoist sighed. He said to the woman, "So what if I die? What's the big deal? Could it be that you still have any regrets?" Fairy Ji calmness said indifferently. That calm, almost indifferent expression made Luo Fan suddenly think of the air hostess. However, compared to Empyrean Maiden, this tranquil fairy had an awe-inspiring and inviolable aura. It was a special aura brought about by her cultivation realm that was countless times stronger than Empyrean Maiden's. Regret? The fact that I can exist is already a blessing from the heavens. Now that I'm dead, even though it's a little short, I can't say that I have any regrets. You're the one who sees things clearly. Taoist Fong Jing laughed when he heard Fairy Tranquil's words. Luo Fan looked at the two of them being so lovey-dovey and could not help but sigh. Fine, I will grant your wish. In truth, Luo Fan did not care about the lives of these two people. As long as they didn't find trouble with him, he didn't mind even if he let them live freely. But, seeing how resolute they were, if he didn't care about them, they definitely wouldn't give up on revenge. Although he wasn't afraid, it would still be troublesome. As such, he naturally made a decision. After speaking, he couldn't be bothered to say anything else. He raised his hand and pointed. The clear light that surged out of his body instantly turned. It arrived beside Taoist Fong Jing and Fairy Ji Jing, and turned slightly. It directly removed the foundation of their existence in the primordial projection, the bit of reality that was attached to the projection. With this removal, Taoist Fong Jing and Fairy Ji Jing's bodies trembled. Then, they seemed to be made of sand. They turned into sand and began to scatter. Soon, they completely turned into smoke. They mixed together and continued to scatter in all directions. In the end, they disappeared without a trace. They couldn't fuse when they were alive, but they finally fused into one after death. As for the boundless power in their bodies, it went without saying. During this process, it was also completely erased along with their death. The power was also a projection. Since Luo Fan could completely erase their existences, he could easily erase all the power in their bodies as well. When he dealt with Taoist Ping Long before, Taoist Ping Long was hundreds of millions of light-years away from him, so there was naturally no need for him to erase the power in his body. All he needed to do was test out his ability to erase the existence of a projection. At that time, he would naturally allow the power of the projection to explode and produce unimaginable might. At this moment, he was not far away from the two of them. If he allowed the power to explode, it would be quite troublesome. Therefore, he had conveniently erased the power in their bodies. This was also why the deaths of the two mid-tier quasi-saints had been so peaceful. After erasing the two of them, Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. He took a step forward and disappeared from the projection of the primordial era in the blink of an eye. When he reappeared, he was already in a certain spacetime that he had seen after becoming a Tao integration expert. This was the spacetime that was attached to the existence of the great Tao. This spacetime was filled with a kind of splendor, a kind of primordial splendor. This splendor was very mysterious. At almost every moment, this splendor was constructing universes that seemed the same but were fundamentally different in nature. This was because these universes were constructed by the primordial light. Hence, they seemed to be covered in a faint layer of fog, which made them look blurry. However, they also emitted an indescribably real aura, so no one dared to doubt their existence. In the face of this primordial light, Luo Fan's eyes were filled with indescribable admiration. At this moment, he was already a Tao integration expert. Everything he saw was many times more than when he was still a void comprehending expert. The moment he stepped into this spacetime, he discovered hundreds and thousands of universes that he was very familiar with among the universes that had evolved from the primordial era. They were universes that were projected from the eras that he had experienced. Clearly, the universes that had evolved from the primordial light were the scenes of eras after the primordial era. To ordinary people, and even ordinary cultivators, the scenes of these universes were the same. There was no difference at all. However, as long as one could become a connate zenith heaven, they would be able to see some differences. He knew that it represented a completely different universe, or in other words, a completely different era. However, only those who had surpassed the connate zenith heaven would be able to see some differences. After becoming an exterminator, one would be able to distinguish the specific differences between the universes and barely be able to distinguish the great differences between the different eras that he was extremely familiar with. Only by reaching the void comprehending realm could one distinguish between eras. Luo Fan was already a Tao integration expert, which was a level higher than the void comprehending realm. His ability to distinguish between eras was naturally much stronger. He could immediately see that the primordial light was displaying the various appearances of the countless eras in the future in a chaotic manner. Among them were the Dharma ending era, the Divine Tao era, the Steel era, the Four Spirits era, the Giant Gods era, and even the Sage era, which Luo Fan was very familiar with. However, there were also starry eras that the Bridge of Eras had not projected, which Luo Fan had never seen before. However, in comparison, the number of eras that Luo Fan had never seen before only accounted for a small portion. What appeared more were the stars of the thousands of eras that Luo Fan had experienced. Furthermore, they appeared repeatedly. For example, in the few breaths that Luo Fan had been floating in the void, the starry sky of the Dharma ending era had appeared more than 30 times. Even the Steel era had appeared more than 20 times. As for the other eras that Luo Fan had never seen, they had only appeared once at most. There were only a few thousand era projections that Luo Fan had experienced, but there were more than 800,000 eras from the primordial era to the Dharma-ending era. The eras after the Dharma-ending era were almost endless. In comparison, the difference between the era projections that Luo Fan had experienced and the sum of all eras was unimaginable. Under such circumstances, the appearance of such a situation was rather strange no matter what. Upon discovering this fact, Luo Fan could not help but frown slightly. After thinking about it carefully, a look of realization appeared in his eyes. If it was the real primordial light, naturally it would not focus on anything. It would display the scenes of all eras almost equally. There would not be a situation where some eras appeared 20 to 30 times, while others only appeared once at most. However, what appeared in front of Luo Fan was not the real primordial light, nor was it the will of the world at the primordial era. It was merely a projection of the real primordial light, and it was only a projection of the world's will. Under such circumstances, the power of the primordial light naturally could not compare to the real primordial light. Instead, it was limited to the artifact that projected it. At this moment, he was confined to the bridge of eras. Hence, the real primordial light could evolve into countless scenes of future eras. However, for the projection of the primordial light, it could only evolve the scenes of future eras that the era bridge was involved in. Hence, the current situation was like this. The eras that Luo Fan had experienced appeared 20 to 30 times within a few breaths, while the era projections that Luo Fan had not experienced only flashed by at most and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. After analyzing all of this, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little disappointed. However, he also felt that it was reasonable. If it could really evolve into countless eras, then the value of the projection of the primordial era would definitely be so high that even a Tao master would not give it up. How could it be placed in front of Luo Fan as a part of the path of integration or the path of transcendence? At this moment, the primordial light in front of him, or rather, the projection of the world's will of the world at the primordial era, seemed to have sensed the arrival of Luo Fan. It suddenly paused and fixed the appearance of a cosmic starry sky. This era that appeared in the cosmic starry sky was something that Luo Fan had never experienced. It was completely unfamiliar, but it was an era that was filled with a sense of destruction everywhere. Luo Fan was in this space-time, which meant that he was surrounded by the primordial light. When the primordial light fixed the light and shadow, Luo Fan felt as if he had been thrown into the projection of a completely unfamiliar era. He even felt that he was surrounded by an endless void. It felt no different from stepping into the projection of a brand new era. At this moment, the entire era shook slightly, and a giant condensed out of thin air. This giant was only tens of thousands of feet tall, and its entire body was translucent. As soon as it appeared, the sense of destruction that permeated the void within a radius of tens of thousands of miles skyrocketed. It even suppressed Luo Fan faintly, causing Luo Fan's body and mind to be slightly affected. This is the projection of the world's will? Luo Fan observed the giant slightly. He was slightly taken aback when he discovered the giant's essence. This giant was almost like the projection of the world's will, and it even possessed all the power of the projection of the world's will. After it took shape, the power that it exuded was beyond imagination. It was unimaginably powerful. Even Luo Fan, who had reached the Tao integration realm, felt that he was simply crushed by its power. This was the power that only the projection of the world's will possessed. Moreover, after the giant appeared, the light that flashed in its eyes was not the kind of light that Luo Fan could not understand. Instead, it was the kind of light that only living beings or powerful cultivators possess. Luo Fan possessed this kind of light, and he had also discovered it in the eyes of Taoist Fang Jing and Fairy Zhi Jing. This fact made Luo Fan instantly understand that there was a huge difference between this giant and the true projection of the world's will. This difference was none other than the giant. It had the will of a living being, and it had the will of a living being that could use its power to fight. This kind of will was enough to crush Luo Fan. The power above the path of integration realm was countless times more powerful than the battle power that the true projection of the world's will could unleash. In other words, this giant was countless times more dangerous than the true projection of the world's will. If Luo Fan had not reached the path of integration realm in the past, he would not have been able to resist such a giant at all. In fact, this giant could easily crush Luo Fan to death with just a light flick of his finger. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but feel a lingering fear. Fortunately, he had discovered the shadow of the sage. Fortunately, he had spent more than 10 years comprehending the mysteries within and finally obtained a crucial breakthrough. If he had stepped into this place when he had just stepped into the primordial era's projection, he would have died within a few breaths and his soul would have dispersed. After the lingering fear, he felt a chill down his spine. The mighty figure who had set up this path of Tao integration, or rather, the path of transcendence, was far too meticulous in his calculations. Each of his breakthroughs seemed to be within his expectations. This was what he had encountered when he had just become an exterminator. This was a hurdle that required one to have the cultivation of the extermination realm in order to pass successfully. When he had become a void-comprehending being, he had encountered a hurdle that required one to have the cultivation of the void-comprehending being. At this moment, when he had just become a Tao integration cultivator, he needed to have the cultivation base of a Tao integration cultivator to pass the checkpoint of becoming a Tao integration cultivator. How could he not feel a chill down his spine in fear when he saw this scheme? Of course, there was another possibility in this situation. That was, the hidden Almighty had specially adjusted the difficulty of the later hurdles according to his ability. If he had not broken through, the difficulty of the hurdles would remain the same. However, if he had broken through, the difficulty of the hurdles would be adjusted to a level that he could only pass after breaking through. If this was the case, the Almighty's scheming ability would be slightly weaker, but the degree of danger would be even greater. To be able to adjust the difficulty of the checkpoint at any time, the power of this kind of magical ability had already far exceeded the limits of what Luo Fan could imagine. Moreover, he had specifically adjusted these projections of countless eras to deal with him. His thoughts and intentions behind it made Luo Fan even more vigilant. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind, but Luo Fan did not stop what he was doing. The power of the divine ability that the giant before him could exert was many times stronger than his. Furthermore, it did not have the weakness of the projection of the will of heaven and earth, and could not fight. Therefore, it should have been able to crush Luo Fan easily. However, it was only a projection of a projection after all. It had two weaknesses, so how could it be a threat to Luo Fan? After the giant was formed, a huge halo suddenly burst out of its body. The halo swept across a range of several light years and enveloped everything within it, including Luo Fan, a galaxy, and dozens of planets. Putting Luo Fan aside, the galaxy and the dozens of planets were directly twisted into nothingness the moment the halo appeared and turned into nothingness. After that, even space itself was shattered into countless fragments. The fragments filled the ring of light, causing the ring of light to seem to be covered in a faint mist. It seemed even more sinister and shocking. Chapter 9:11. Unlike the projection of the will of the world, the giant obviously did not only know one move. Thus, it could only choose one method. After discovering that this halo was useless against Luo Fan, it raised its hand and grabbed at the void. He raised his hand and grasped at the void. A huge hammer composed of countless rings of light condensed in his hand out of thin air. Then, he slammed the hammer down on Luo Fan. The hammer was condensed by countless halos, each of which occupied the most suitable position, outlining the hammer as if it was real. There was not a trace of illusion, let alone the fact that it had been condensed by halos. As soon as the hammer appeared, Another ring of light suddenly superimposed on the ring of destruction that had engulfed a radius of several light-years. The destructive aura even shattered time itself, producing a strange smoke. The smoke and dust combined with the debris formed by the shattering of the void, forming a mysterious space-time. Of course, such a change was still within the range of a few hundred feet around Luo Fan's body. Not to mention time, even space was not affected in the slightest within the range of a few hundred feet. Clearly, the giant had not condensed the hammer for the appearance of this halo. It raised its hammer high and drew a mysterious arc that seemed to contain all the principles of martial arts and all the mysteries of the great Tao. It then fell down on Luo Fan with a loud rumble. Judging by its posture, it seemed that even if Luo Fan could cross millions of space-time in an instant, he would not be able to escape. The moment the hammer smashed down on him, Luo Fan felt his life origin shake violently. His entire body sensed an aura that was about to be destroyed. It was as if his entire body and life origin would be completely turned into nothingness in the next instant. His existence would be in countless space-time. It was as if the past, present, and future would be completely erased. In such a space-time, Luo Fan could not help but be in awe. The projection of the will of the world was indeed unbelievably powerful. As long as the will of a living being was controlling it, the power that the projection of the world could unleash was actually already at the Tao integration realm. To think that he had already reached the Tao integration stage, a level that was far beyond his imagination. At this moment, this hammer strike seemed simple, but the principles contained within it were profound and mysterious. With just a single look, Luo Fan felt that he had comprehended a great deal. His attainment in martial arts, which was already close to the peak, instantly increased by quite a bit. If this was the true will of heaven and earth, it was impossible for Luo Fan to resist such a hammer strike. Even if he unleashed all of his power, he would only be able to delay his own death at most. However, there was no if in the current situation. No matter how powerful the hammer was, no matter how unbelievable it was, no matter how great the profoundness contained within it was for Luo Fan, its foundation was still the giant in front of it, the projection of the primordial era, condensed from the will of the world. It was just a projection within a projection. That was the weakness of the projection that Luo Fan had grasped. Once it had one, it had two. Under such circumstances, such a move posed no threat to him at all. Facing the oncoming giant hammer, Luo Fan slightly smiled and slightly moved his mind. With a thought, he raised his right hand with great difficulty and poked at the void gently. With this poke, the giant's hammer trembled slightly and instantly shattered into countless halos. After turning into halos, the changes did not stop. Instead, they continued to evolve. The ring of light continued to shatter under an extremely strange power. In an instant, it shattered into countless specks of light. The specks of light scattered in all directions. In the blink of an eye, the strange universe formed by the initial light was enveloped in the specks of light formed by the ring of light. It was extremely magical. However, it was obvious that no one else could appreciate this fantasy. There was a look of shock in the giant's eyes, which was impossible for a normal projection of the world's will to appear. It grabbed at the air with both hands, trying to condense something again. However, the existence that it wanted to condense did not even have a complete silhouette. Instead, it directly turned into countless specks of light and scattered in all directions. Although Luo Fan might be able to comprehend more principles of battle and destruction by letting the giant attack, he did not intend to waste any more time here. Ever since he had entered the initial era, he had already wasted far too much time. If he continued to probe and fight the giant here, he would definitely be able to obtain more principles. However, this was not what he needed. In comparison, it was more important for him to find the core of the initial light as soon as possible. Finding the key to the projection of the world's will from the initial era was more important. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, the power in Luo Fan's body shook. It directly rushed out of his palm and turned into a giant hand of clear light that was hundreds of meters wide. It directly grabbed forward. This grab conformed to the countless martial principles he'd grasped. It seemed to be crude and simple, yet it was simple and profound. Every single inch it moved forward contained countless variations, and it was utterly impossible for others to grasp. Ordinary living beings would feel dizzy from just a single glance at it. However, it was clear that this sort of profundity was nothing to the giant. The giant looked over and had hundreds of ways to deal with it. It raised its giant hand and grabbed towards the giant hand. Its movements were extremely exquisite and profound. Under normal circumstances, this grab would not have been able to be blocked by the giant hand of clear light. It would have directly stabbed into the giant hand's weak point and wiped it out. However, it was clear that this was not normal. Although the path forward of the giant hand of clear light had been blocked and all changes had been grasped by the giant hand, no matter how the giant hand changed, it could not really hit the giant hand's weak point. Instead, the giant hand of clear light easily pierced into the chest of the giant. Following this, the giant's expression changed drastically. There was no time for it to make any sound or change its movements. The giant hand appeared like a phantom and gripped the two weak points of the giant hand of clear light tightly. However, it could not affect the giant hand of clear light at all. On the contrary, the giant body of clear light directly exploded due to the actions of the giant hand of clear light. It turned into fine powder and disappeared without a trace before the initial light could even recover. Following this change, the entire universe formed by the initial light suddenly collapsed, turning back into a vast expanse of light that distorted wildly. It rapidly changed, and it looked like another era and another space-time was about to form. It was about to evolve into another projection of the world's will to fight against Luo Fan. However, obviously, Luo Fan would not give it such a chance. Luo Fan could easily find the weak points of all projections and destroy them completely through those weak points. The initial light in this space-time was naturally no secret to him. With a glance, he had already found the key core of the initial light. He took a gentle step forward, and his figure instantly traversed a distance of tens of thousands of light-years. He arrived at a place that seemed ordinary, but the primordial charm contained within the initial light was tens of thousands of times richer than other places. Arriving at this place, he raised his hand and lightly covered the spherical void within a radius of several hundred miles with an invisible barrier of light. Primordial light surged wildly within the light barrier. The concentration increased at the speed of light. At the same time, the initial light in the entire void was visibly thinning. In the span of a few dozen breaths, the initial light that was enveloped by the light barrier had completely disappeared. It had already condensed into a huge ball of light that looked like the sun. On the other hand, the initial light in the outside world had completely disappeared. The entire space-time had turned into a pitch-black void, as if it had never been enveloped by the initial light. The sun-like ball of light that was covered by the light barrier was not calm. Instead, it was rolling crazily and evolving billions of mysterious and unbelievable images. These images were all-encompassing. There was a giant who could destroy the world with a single hand. There was a formless creature that had integrated into the void, as well as strange insects that were as tiny as dust. There were countless starry skies and whirlpool-like galaxies. There were all sorts of strange things. Almost everything that Luo Fan could imagine existed within it. Even after being compressed to this extent, it's still not obedient? Luo Fan sighed and raised his hand to poke it gently. All the changes within the ball of light suddenly came to a halt. It was as if time had come to a standstill. The entire ball of light was fixed in an extremely strange form. It seemed like a space-time, a universe, or a huge brain. This light barrier was specially condensed by Luo Fan to target the projection characteristics of the initial light. It didn't directly target the power of the initial light, but rather the essence of the existence of the initial light. It directly compressed the size of the initial light. It was precisely because of this property that the light barrier could completely cut off the source of the initial light that filled the entire spacetime and spread over tens of thousands of light years, compressing it into a ball of light with a diameter of several hundred kilometers. In fact, this ball of light could be said to be the projection of the initial era's world will. It was this ball of light that had evolved the universe of countless eras, evolved the projection of the era of destruction, and bestowed the projection with the will of the living beings and the will to fight. However, even though it possessed this ability and bestowed the projection with the will of the living beings and the will to fight, it did not possess the will of the living beings and the will to fight. It was still the same as the projection of the world will. It still did not possess any combat ability and was unable to perfectly unleash the various powers contained within it. This was just like the various machine tools that could produce cars but did not possess the functions of cars. Such an existence did not pose much of a threat to Luo Fan at the moment. Even Luo Fan, who had yet to reach Tao integration, would not pose much of a threat to him. Seeing that he had already stopped the projection of the world will from the initial era, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. He took a step forward and stood on the light barrier. The power around him surged, and hundreds of thousands of different powers condensed into a mysterious power combination in front of him. It looked like a strange colorless and transparent light. Next, his perception rushed out and completely fused with the power combination. As his perception fused with it, the strange light distorted rapidly and turned into a willpower with perception as its core. Yes, it was a willpower that was similar to the perception willpower that he had condensed when he had comprehended the mysteries of the Saint's shadow. However, after using it a few times before, his control over this willpower had improved. As the willpower distorted slightly, it had already taken the form of another Luo Fan. It was so detailed that it looked no different from Luo Fan's original body. After this willpower was condensed, it did not look at Luo Fan at all. Since it was all him, there was naturally no such nonsense like, "Fellow Taoist, please." It directly sank into the light barrier below, and completely fused with the initial light sphere that was like a sun. As it fused, endless information surged into Luo Fan's mind through the perception that was connected to the willpower. In an instant, it was absorbed by Luo Fan and completely fused with the depths of his memories, turning into various comprehensions. This initial era was completely different from all the era projections that Luo Fan had experienced in the past. This was the first era that had appeared in this universe. It was the origin of all eras. Before this era, there was no era at all. There was only a boundless world. There was an incomparably vast cultivation civilization and a space-time where saints existed. After this era, there were only eras that repeated every 5-6 billion years. There were also eras where the world was destroyed again and again. It was such a mysterious era. How could it be the same as ordinary eras? This could be seen from the projection of the world will from the initial era. How could the projection of the world will from other eras evolve into the scenes of the future eras? In reality, this initial era could be said to be the origin of the era tide. The era tide that even saints could not resist was in this era. Of course, this was in the true initial era. At the moment where Luo Fan was, this was just a projection of the true initial era. Perhaps it contained some of the era tide's mysteries, but it was definitely not everything. The information that Luo Fan received was endless. Among the mysteries of the projection of the world will from the initial era, apart from the various other projections of the world will, there were also many more profound and incomprehensible pieces of information that Luo Fan had never seen before. There was a lot of information, and it was very mysterious. It was so much so that Luo Fan felt that he could not remember it at all. It was as if this information was just a passing station in the depths of his memory. After a slight shake, it left in another direction. This situation was somewhat unexpected to Luo Fan. However, it was not to the point where he could not believe it or understand it. After thinking about it for a while, he clearly understood what was going on. The information that he could not retain was related to the mysteries of the Eratide's origins. As for the trend of the times, it was something that even sages could not resist or go against. Although he was a path integration expert, he was still far from being comparable to a saint. However, compared to the sages, they were still far behind. How could they truly understand the origins of the trends of the times? Although Luo Fan was unwilling to accept this, he could only accept it. Fortunately, after experiencing the saint's projection, he had a better understanding of what to give up and his mind became clearer. He did not feel any negative emotions because the supreme mysteries of the Earth's universe were right in front of him, but he could not take it for himself. His expression was still calm, and his body was still steady and calm. Time passed by slowly. In the blink of an eye, 1,000 years had passed. The projection of the world's will from the primordial era was much more complicated and profound than the projection of the world's will from other eras. Luo Fan had spent 10 times more time than the projection of the world's will from other eras in order to obtain all the mysteries he could obtain. After becoming a path integration expert, Luo Fan already possessed the power to adjust the flow of time in this spacetime. He no longer needed to be restricted by the projection of the world will from this era. Thus, to the outside world, 1,000 years was only a few days. Although it was still several decades outside the era bridge, compared to the 1,000 years that Luo Fan had experienced, it was already much better. On this day, Luo Fan let out a long breath. He looked a little disappointed, but he also opened his eyes in pleasant surprise. Over the 1,000 years, he had worked hard to receive the information contained within the projection of the world will from this era. He had worked hard to understand the mysteries within, to understand the form of existence of the projection of the world will from the initial era, and to understand how it operated. He had worked even harder to understand the origin and essence of the Eratide contained within. In the end, he had gained a lot, but he had also watched many principles disappear before his eyes. Because of this, his expression had changed. There was disappointment and pleasant surprise on his face. Needless to say, he was disappointed. What made him pleasantly surprised was that, over the years, he had finally retained a trace of the essence and mystery of the origin of the Eratide that he could not retain at all. That's right, the various information that he had treated as an ordinary station in the depths of his memory that would disappear in a flash finally stayed in the depths of his memory. Compared to the essence and mystery of the origin of the Eratide, this trace was like a drop in the ocean. The essence and mystery of the origin of the Eratide contained within the projection of the world will from the initial era was also like a drop in the ocean compared to the true origin of the Eratide. However, this kind of gain was enough of a pleasant surprise for Luo Fan. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed. The will that had fused with the initial light's sun and was based on perception trembled slightly. A faint, almost negligible bright red light dyed this will from nothing, causing it to gradually take on an extremely faint bright red luster. Chapter 9:12. This bright red luster was so profound. Although it was only an extremely faint trace, it had already caused Luo Fan's will, which was based on perception, to undergo an earth-shattering change. This change made the strength of the willpower seem to increase by 1,000 times in an instant. It was also completely separated from the huge sun formed by the initial light, which was originally fused with it. Although the sun formed by the initial light was frantically squeezing it in an attempt to fuse it into its body, no matter what kind of pressure, impact, or power it exerted, it was unable to shake the will that was emitting an extremely faint red light at all. It was as if this will was eternal and eternal. Even if the universe were to be destroyed, it would not be damaged at all. At this moment, Luo Fan could clearly sense all the feelings of that will through the connection of perception. In that feeling, although his strength did not increase in the slightest, he seemed to have fused with some kind of unshakable, never-ending, and irresistible existence. Where he was unshakable and eternally immovable. With a slight movement of his body, the entire sun formed by the initial light trembled violently. It was as if he was not only the size of a normal person, but was even larger than the sun. The sun could not withstand his existence at all, and with just a slight movement, he could stir it up completely. In fact, the sun seemed to be on the verge of exploding in an instant. So this is the trend of the times. Luo Fan let out a long sigh as a rather complicated expression flashed across his face. This incomparably faint bright red radiance. That was because the will he had obtained from the projection of the world's will from the primordial era below him over the past 1,000 years. That was the trace of the mysteries of the times left in the depths of his memories. Compared to the profound mysteries that existed in the projection of the will of the world during the primordial era, the mysteries related to the tides of the times were much more profound. It was extremely insignificant. The profundity of the era tide contained in the projection of the primordial era was insignificant compared to the true era tide. From this, one could see the difference between the traces of profound mysteries he had comprehended and the true mysteries contained in the trend of the times. However, it was precisely these extremely insignificant traces of profoundness. However, it had already given Luo Fan the foundation to connect himself with the trend of the times, and had already allowed Luo Fan to slightly display some divine abilities with the characteristics of the trend of the times. At this moment, his will was stained with that bright red light. Although it seemed extremely faint, it had already allowed his will to contain traces of the characteristics of the times. It had unknowingly resonated with the trend of the times. The resonance was extremely weak, but it was enough to increase the might of the will by countless times. With a slight thought from Luo Fan, the will abruptly raised its hands high and grabbed at the air. As if grabbing a soft cloth, it grabbed the endless initial light in the surroundings. Then, he tore it apart with both his hands. A tearing sound that could not be described with words, one that Luo Fan had never heard before, suddenly rang out. In an instant, the initial light condensed into an incomparably bright sun. Suddenly, starting from the place where the will's hands grabbed, it gradually disappeared and spread out at an unimaginable speed. In just a few breaths' time, the sun formed by the entire initial light disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had never appeared in the first place. Then, as the sun disappeared, the entire strange spacetime, as well as the existence that the spacetime was attached to, spread out. It directly affected the projection of the entire initial era, causing the entire universe to disappear and turn into nothingness. The ending process of this stage was actually completely different from all the stages that Luo Fan had experienced in the past. In the past, all the stages had the universe shatter at the same time. Even if the appearance was slightly different, it was only the method of shattering and the speed of shattering. It was unlike this time, where it was as if an existence of nothingness had directly engulfed the entire universe and the projection of the entire era from the inside out. However, this time, when everything calmed down and the entire universe disappeared completely, the information backlash that would appear after every time the projection of the era shattered in the past did not appear. It was as if there had never been any information backlash at all. Clearly, the tearing of the will that was tainted by the faint bright red light had not only completely destroyed the projection of the primordial era, but it had also destroyed the projection of the primordial era along with any information backlash that might have occurred. It was as if its destruction at this moment was the true process of its destruction. The way it had disappeared at this moment was the way that the initial era should have disappeared. The information backlash after an era's projection was destroyed was because its original normal destruction method had been broken. The contradiction between this destruction method and the true destruction method of the era caused the original destruction method of the era to be replaced by another era's normal destruction method at the last moment. In other words, the entire process of the era's destruction being replaced by another era's would be transmitted in the form of extremely compressed information directly into the mind and consciousness of the being that had destroyed the era. This was because the amount of information was huge and the duration was short, which was why it was called information backlash. If there was a being that could withstand such a large amount of information erupting in such a short period of time, this process would not be information backlash, but a type of benefit from the destruction of the era. However, at this moment, under the effect of the will, the era's destruction was so natural that it was as if the era was supposed to be destroyed in the first place. How could there be any information about the true destruction process? Obviously, in this way, there wouldn't be any information backlash. The reason why the will that was tainted with a bright red luster was used to destroy the changes in the era was very simple. It was because the will carried the characteristics of the era's trend. By destroying the projection of the era, it was equivalent to the era's trend destroying the era. Evidently, the era's trend was going to destroy an era. Naturally, just like fate, the world had reversed its original fate of destruction and the original process of destruction. Of course, if it had been the real era, the bright red luster on Luofan's will would not have been enough to accomplish such a great feat. Even if it had been fortunate enough to destroy the era, it would not have been enough to change fate. After all, the profundity of the era's trend was too little. The mysteries of the trend of the times were too little, and it was impossible for them to replace the true trend of the times. However, it was different on the bridge of time. The projection of the primordial era was one of the 9,990 checkpoints. It was the most realistic projection of the era. However, a projection was a projection. No matter how realistic it was still a projection. For such a projection, the profundity of the era's trend that Luofan had comprehended was enough to change its fate. Seeing the era's destruction disappear, Luofan thought for a while and understood the reasons above. He was a little disappointed that the information backlash did not appear. As mentioned above, for him, who could withstand such a large amount of information simultaneously in such a short period of time, this was not a backlash. It was a benefit. However, he was more delighted. That was because such a reality had already allowed him to understand. The profundity of the era's trend that he had comprehended was much more valuable than the information backlash. With a single thought, that bit of willpower shattered with a loud bang, and returned to being hundreds of thousands of different types of power and wisps of perception. It burrowed back into his body. At the same time, the bright red color that could distort the fate of the era's projection also disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. With a thought, he focused his attention on the next checkpoint. At this moment, he was filled with curiosity. The 9,990th checkpoint was the last checkpoint that existed as a projection of the era. What would the next 9 checkpoints be like? Although Luofan was very sure that the next checkpoint would be extremely dangerous for him, and if he was not careful, he might die and his soul would scatter, but he still couldn't help but have a curious and expectant mentality. After all, he had been on the bridge of time for a long time. Throughout these years, his thoughts were practically all about these checkpoints. How could his thoughts not be changed because of this? How could he still act as aloof as before he entered this place? The blurry light and shadow in front of him gradually became clear. When everything calmed down, Luofan suddenly discovered that he had arrived at a strange place. This was a boundless void. It was not the void in the universe. Instead, it was completely different. It was not completely void, but it was a void that was completely different from the real universe. In this void, there were no stars, no yuan qi, and not even any light. There was only the stable space, the stable time, and the extremely strict rules and laws. After arriving here, Luofan frowned slightly. He looked around, and the perspective that he had obtained after becoming a Tao integration cultivator, which allowed him to see through all projections, immediately unfolded. However, everything in front of him gave him a huge shock. This was because the scene in front of him did not change at all. It was still a boundless void that did not even have stars or vitality. It was as if he had not changed his perspective at all. Regarding his own ability, Luo Fan did not have the slightest doubt. He clearly sensed that his perspective had changed. His perspective that could see through all projections had played an absolute role. It was not because he was suppressed by the void in front of him or some other existence that he could not see through the truth. In this case, there is only one possibility. This is not a projection. This is the real void. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. After this thought flashed through his mind, the perspective of his eyes changed once again, directly pushing aside all the obstacles in front of him. He pushed aside the obstruction of countless rules and laws, pushed aside the barriers of time and space, and looked at the existence that seemed to be the great Tao that definitely existed in this void space. He frowned even more when he saw it. This existence was many times more powerful than the one he had seen in the primordial era. The lingering charm that it exuded contained a kind of reality that was incomparable to the existence that Luo Fan had seen in the primordial era projection, and it also had a power that was many times more powerful than that. Furthermore, there were countless spacetimes attached to it. Every spacetime seemed to be shrouded in some kind of fog. It seemed to be shrouded in some kind of fog. Although it was not like the real Earth's universe, which made it impossible for him to see through its laws, it was not like a projection, so Luo Fan could distinguish between reality and illusion with one look. It seemed to be in between the two. It was much more realistic than the spacetime of the era projection, but it was far from the real Earth's universe. Seeing this, Luo Fan finally confirmed his guess. This place was indeed not like the more than 9,000 levels that he had experienced before. It was just a projection. This was a strange place between projection and reality. It was neither reality nor projection. This is the 9,991st level. It is the intermediate stage of the quasi-sage dreamland. The way to pass it is to find the dreamland's owner and defeat him. At this moment, the voice of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era suddenly reached Luo Fan's ears. This voice was so sudden and fleeting that Luo Fan couldn't find its source at all. In fact, he couldn't even tell where it was coming from. In that instant, Luo Fan understood that the power of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era had been greatly enhanced, just like him. At the very least, it wouldn't be any weaker than when he became a Tao integration stage cultivator. Only when it reached the same level as him could. Only the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era could do this. It was able to completely suppress his senses, making it impossible for him to find its location or even the direction from which its voice was coming from. The fact that a treasure spirit at the Tao integration stage could suppress the perception of Luo Fan, who was at the same level, was not a fantasy. The reason for this was very simple. This was because Luo Fan was currently on the bridge of the era. It could be said that he was in the world of the bridge of the era. In this position, the power of the bridge of the era was much stronger than its normal power. Naturally, it could suppress Luo Fan's senses. Perhaps I should say that it's as I expected. Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly as he thought about this. The strength of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era had increased abruptly. Luo Fan couldn't react at all. However, after thinking about it carefully, he knew that there was a certain inevitability to this. After all, when he was still an exterminator, the power of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era had surpassed the perfected stage and was roughly equivalent to the extermination stage. It had an advantage over him, but not by much. After he became a void-comprehending expert, the treasure spirit had increased again and reached the same level as the void-comprehending expert. However, it still suppressed him. Based on this, It was not unbelievable that he had become a Tao integration stage cultivator, and the treasure spirit had increased to the level of the Tao integration stage. It was not beyond the logic of what he had imagined at the beginning. After smiling bitterly, Luo Fan turned to pay attention to what the treasure spirit had said. So it's a dream. No wonder it's between reality and projection. After thinking about what the treasure spirit had said for a while, Luo Fan couldn't help but have such a thought in his mind. The dream of an ordinary person was naturally completely illusory and was just an activity of thought. But for ordinary cultivators, their dreams were a kind of projection of reality in their hearts. When a cultivator was powerful enough to reach the connate zenith heaven realm, the projection in their mind would undergo some subtle changes. It would become a wondrous existence between reality and illusion. The reason was not difficult to understand. Connate zenith heaven realm cultivators had reached the perfected stage and could produce vitality on their own. They could even survive without relying on external objects and were powerful existences that could open up worlds. When such powerful existences were dreaming, the violent fluctuations of their mind and emotions would project the world in their dreams and change a certain spacetime in the real universe. From then on, everything in that spacetime would happen like what happened in their dreams, and all the laws in that spacetime would act according to the laws in their dreams. This seemed unbelievable and outrageous, but it was not the case. After all, 4 connate zenith heaven realm cultivators who had reached the perfected stage, there was no longer any loophole in their control of their bodies and minds. If they wanted to sleep, they would naturally sleep. It was almost impossible for them to dream. Therefore, even if connate zenith heaven realm cultivators had the unbelievable ability to change reality in their dreams, it rarely happened. However, the dream of connate zenith heaven realm cultivators had the power to change the real world. The dream of intermediate stage sage to be would naturally be even more mysterious and could not be worse than this. Therefore, it was only natural for this spacetime that was between reality and projection to be produced. As for why intermediate stage sage to be would not be able to control their mind and emotions and produce such a dream, there was no need to explain the reason. Apart from the almighty figures hidden behind the bridge of time, Luo Fan could not think of any other reason that would cause them to be unable to control their mind and emotions and produce such a dream world. At this moment, a strange sound suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It entered his ears and flowed into his mind. The sound was a melodious and gentle music. The music was indiscernible at first, and one would almost overlook it if they were not careful. However, as time passed, it grew clearer and louder. Chapter 9:13. It felt great to watch it without any advertisements. In the process of the soft music ringing in Luo Fan's ears, the entire spacetime had undergone earth-shaking changes in an unimaginable way. Disco #1 hashtag, changing the structure of spacetime and changing the shape of the world, was something that practically any innate grand heavenly realm cultivator had experienced. On the other hand, the world that Luo Fan had created was counted in the millions, so his experience was naturally extremely abundant. However, the way that the spacetime was changing was completely different from all the experiences that Luo Fan had experienced. To Luo Fan, if he wanted to change the appearance of a spacetime, he basically had to start from the fundamental structure, the fundamental laws, and the fundamental rules. He would change the spacetime and the world bit by bit, starting from simple to complicated method. However, the spacetime before him was not changing in a normal way. Instead, it was like building blocks, and the entire spacetime was changing into a form that was completely different from before. In the blink of an eye, the boundless space before him had become a boundless continent. The continent was filled with extremely dense Xiantian qi, and there were even wisps of grayish chaotic qi mixed in it. When he raised his head and looked up, the sky had somehow become no different from the normal sky. The sun that hung high in the sky and the boundless blue sky indicated that the current spacetime was extremely different from before. Luo Fan looked around and noticed that the continent was not only several tens of thousands of light-years wide, but it was almost boundless. Moreover, the entire continent was not desolate at all. Instead, it was filled with boundless vitality, and there were countless living beings living on the continent. Among these living beings, apart from plants, even the low-level and unintelligent living beings were powerful beyond Luo Fan's imagination. Almost every living being was as powerful as an innate grand heavenly realm cultivator. These living beings, they were densely packed on the continent. It was like an ordinary creature in a normal world. Just from what Luo Fan could sense at a glance, he could tell that the most powerful living being within a radius of several dozen light-years was equivalent to a Tao integration stage super mighty figure. In other words, he was equivalent to a cultivator who had severed his second corpse. This continent spanned tens of thousands of light-years, and it was easy to imagine how many powerhouses of this level there were. After this change, the stability of space, the stability of time, and the strictness of the nomological laws had all increased tremendously. At this moment everything was happening. It had even surpassed the level of the great thousand worlds and perfect heaven and earth. If one were to compare them, only a world like the great Tianyuan world could compare. It seems that this is the world that the intermediate quasi-sanctum dreams of. Luo Fan sensed all of this, and such a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. This world was a dreamland between projection and reality. The duration of its existence was determined by the time the mid-level sage-to-be dreamer dreamt, and the form of its existence was determined. The way it was constructed and everything else was decided by the dream of the mid-stage sage-to-be. There were trillions of innate grand heavenly realm cultivators acting as mortals. There were countless existences at the sage-to-be grand heavenly realm on this continent. Obviously, it was impossible for them to appear in reality, and it was impossible for the intermediate quasi-sanctum to have seen them with his own eyes. In this case, the intermediate quasi-sanctum dreamt of this because he was looking forward to the existence of such a world. In other words, he was dreaming of reaching such a world. As for the reason, it was obvious that the intermediate quasi-sanctum dreamt of this world. Of course, the greatest hope of a normal cultivator was to improve his cultivation realm, to improve his life essence. For the intermediate quasi-sanctum, it was unimaginably difficult to improve and continue to sever his second corpse to finally become a sage. It would take tens of billions of years or even hundreds of billions of years to even have a sliver of a chance to reach the final goal. Disco Network. Since the primordial era, there had been a shift in the wheel of time in 5-6 billion years. For the cultivators living on Earth, who were affected by the wheel of time, a time that was calculated in terms of billions or even billions of years was too much of a luxury for them. It was so extravagant that they could only dream of it. As for why this world that wasn't affected by the trends of the times would look like something that couldn't possibly appear in reality, it was obviously the cultivator's wild imagination. Or rather, it could be said that it was born out of instinct. It was his most direct expectation. When he discovered all of this, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable feeling in his heart. Out of nowhere, the soft music, which had been incessantly pouring into his ears, had somehow disappeared without him noticing it. No matter how Luo Fan thought about it, he couldn't figure out how the music had disappeared and when it had disappeared. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember how the world had turned into such a state, and when exactly did it begin to form into such a state. The hallucinatory aspect could only appear in dreams. Since it's a dream, the intermediate sage-to-be is naturally the center of the dreamland. The entire dreamland must revolve around him. It doesn't seem too difficult to find him. As Luo Fan thought about this, he took a step forward and arrived in the sky that was thousands of miles above the ground. The sky of the dreamland was boundlessly high. The sun that seemed to be suspended in the sky was, in fact, infinitely far away from the ground. Obviously, this situation could not appear in reality. Luo Fan floated high in the sky, tens of thousands of miles above the ground, and looked down. The entire earth was almost in his eyes, and he could even faintly see the end of the continent that was tens of thousands of light years away. In this dreamland, the supreme rule of the speed of light did not exist at all. The rule of the speed of light did not exist either. At the end of the continent that was thousands of light years away, what Luo Fan saw was happening. There was no time interval like in the real universe. After becoming a Tao integration expert, Luo Fan's perception in the real world could almost cover the entire Earth's universe for hundreds of millions of light years. He could even completely grasp the location of all the cultivators living there. But here, obviously, this situation did not exist in this dreamland. His perception was limited to a range of several light years around him. Anything beyond this range could only be seen with his eyes. He could not sense it with his own perception. Therefore, in the normal Earth universe, he only needed to slightly sense this continent that spanned tens of thousands of light years to be able to grasp everything that was happening within it. He could even completely grasp all of the history within it. However, here, he could only see how vast this continent was with his own eyes. The scenery was magnificent and beautiful. He could see countless towering mountains, long rivers, and streaks of light flashing across the void. However, he could not see everything as clearly as in the real universe. This situation caused some trouble for Luo Fan to find the intermediate sage to be. However, it was just a little trouble. According to the form of existence of this world, this was what the intermediate stage quasi-sage was thinking. It was to raise one's cultivation level, to make one's body stronger. Therefore, it was most likely either he was already the most powerful existence in this dream, such as a sage, or he had encountered an unimaginably powerful encounter that would allow him to grow into the most powerful cultivator in a short period of time. At this moment, Luo Fan still did not know which of these two possibilities it was, but it was not difficult to verify it. However, this was not something that could be done in a short period of time. At this moment, what Luo Fan needed to do was something more important. That was to comprehend the laws and principles of this dreamland. He sensed the characteristics of this dream realm so that he could fully unleash his supreme Tao integration stage power in this dream realm. The rules and laws of this dream world, as well as other things, existed in a completely different form from the real universe. If he were to use the experience of the real universe to enter it, he would definitely be courting death. However, even though the dreamscape was crazy and strange, it was still formed from the dreamscape of a mid-stage quasi-sage. There had to be some kind of perfect, impeccable rule that treated everyone equally. For example, the laws, the stability of the space, the stability of time, the strength of the cultivators, and the cultivation methods were all traceable. As long as someone could grasp the secrets within, they would definitely be able to make use of it. They would definitely be able to obtain boundless power and supreme might. This was something that a mid-tier sage-to-be must have. It was a will that could not be defied even if it was instinctively. It could even be raised to the level of principle. This dreamscape was born of instinct, so it naturally had to follow the principles of instinct and be constructed according to the various thoughts and ideas of instinct. However, it could not be born out of thin air. Just like the dreamscape of ordinary people, it could suddenly fly in the sky, escape into the ground, appear here, and appear there. This was actually not difficult to guess. If the dreamscape of a mid-stage quasi-sage was really as chaotic as that of ordinary living beings, how could such a stable continent be formed? How could such a seemingly real spacetime be formed? That's the principle. So that's where my strange feeling came from. Luo Fan suddenly thought of something and showed an indescribable look of surprise. Previously, when he discovered various things on this continent, he suddenly felt an indescribable feeling. At that time, he just thought that it was because the music had suddenly disappeared, and he could not sense the process of its disappearance or the time of its disappearance at all. At this moment, he was seized by a sudden impulse and found the real source of that feeling. It turned out that the time in this dreamscape seemed to be completely separated from the time in the outside world. In other words, no matter how much time passed in this dreamscape, it had nothing to do with the time in the outside world. Moreover, it was not the same as the space-time separation that Luo Fan had experienced in the past. The time in this dreamscape had more freedom than all the space-time separation that Luo Fan had experienced in the past. It could even be said that it could be proved or reversed, and it could be fast or slow. It was because of this strange difference in time that Luo Fan had that indescribable feeling. After understanding the source of this feeling, Luo Fan suddenly had a better understanding of that indescribable feeling and could describe it a little. That feeling was as if the pressure on his body was weightless. It was as if the nothingness that did not seem to exist at all was suddenly put down in the air. It was a kind of relaxation and freedom. It was a feeling of comfort and contentment that filled his heart. The weightless, massless, and seemingly non-existent pressure of nothingness was none other than the mental pressure caused by the flow of time that was 10,000 times slower than the outside world. Although Luo Fan did not seem to feel much that the flow of time on the bridge of times was 10,000 times slower than the outside world. But that was just the appearance. As someone who would rather use a year as tens of millions of years, cultivating with the normal flow of time was already an extremely extravagant behavior, let alone using 10,000 years as a year. This was simply a shocking waste. No matter how rational he was and how much he comforted himself, that kind of self-awareness was a waste of time. The feeling of wasting his life still permeated the depths of his heart, and he could not completely get over it. And this kind of waste of time, the feeling of wasting one's life, would naturally create a subtle pressure on his soul. This kind of pressure, because of Luo Fan's rationality and his outstanding control over his own body, could not affect him at all. After all, the pressure was too weak, so weak that even he would ignore it. But at this moment, when he stepped into this dreamland, although he did not directly sense it, his body and his heart instinctively sensed the uniqueness of this dreamland and the difference between the time in this dreamland and the time in the outside world. Under such circumstances, the pressure that had been pressing on the depths of his heart naturally dissipated. It was like wiping a pair of glasses. It was just like wiping glasses. You would only know how dirty the lenses were after wiping them clean. It was the same for Luo Fan. Only after the pressure had completely disappeared did he realize how the pressure had existed in the depths of his heart and how it had affected him. Understanding this, Luo Fan could not help but reveal an inexplicable smile. It seems that I have to modify my plan. Perhaps I don't have to look for that intermediate sage-to-be. As long as I do some deeds, that intermediate sage-to-be will come to me on his own initiative, he thought to himself. Of course, this idea did not suddenly come to his mind. In fact, it had always been lying in the depths of his memory. He did not take it out before because if he did so, it would be a little negative. Although he could achieve his goal in the end, he might waste a lot of time. Evidently, before he realized that the dreamland was completely separated from the outside world and that no matter how long passed in here, it would only be the time taken for the intermediate sage-to-be to take a nap in the outside world. Therefore, he would never choose such a pessimistic plan that he had no idea how long it would last and how much time he would waste. However, it was different at this moment. No matter which era it was, the location of the intermediate sage-to-be was in the normal Earth universe. Therefore, the flow of time there should be normal. Even if the flow of time was different, it could only be faster, not slower. After all, due to the threat of the rotation of eras, each practitioner could only spend billions of years at most, which was obviously not enough for the practitioners of the sage-to-be realm. Who would waste time by slowing down the flow of time there? Under such circumstances, even if the sage-to-be slept for 10,000 years, which was already extremely exaggerated, it would only be equivalent to 1 year on the epic bridge. For Luo Fan, this amount of time was nothing. Naturally, he would not care about it. After making up his mind, Luo Fan did not hesitate. With a shake of his body, he turned into a conveyance light and shot towards a city on the plain outside the mountains. If he wanted to attract the intermediate sage-to-be to look for him, he naturally needed to have a reputation. However, reputation could not be obtained out of thin air. It could only appear when he interacted with other living beings. For a dream, everything in it was under the control of the dreamer. Even if it was just a dream, what happened in it would definitely develop according to the dreamer's instinctive thinking. Although this dreamland was from the intermediate sage-to-be and was much more realistic than ordinary dreamlands, there was no exception. Therefore, Luo Fan didn't need to do anything special, nor did he need to change the world. He only needed to spread his name in this world. His behavior was completely beyond the grasp of the sage-to-be, so it would naturally attract the attention of the sage-to-be. When the interest of the sage-to-be was aroused, he would naturally take the initiative to look for Luo Fan. As for the identity of the sage-to-be, whether he was the most powerful sage or a very weak protagonist who could improve at an extremely fast speed due to extraordinary opportunities, how the sage-to-be would react after looking for him, and how the sage-to-be should react, these were all things that would happen after the sage-to-be found. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to cast a recommendation vote or a monthly vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. @Disco, net, for the latest and fastest chapters. Please log in. Reading is a pleasure. I suggest you collect it. Chapter 914. It felt great to watch it without advertisements. The city was not far from where Luo Fan had appeared. It was only several tens of thousands of miles away. Disco number 1. Although the dreamland spacetime was completely different from the normal Earth universe, it did not have many restrictions on the power of a cultivator. Therefore, in just a few short breaths, Luo Fan had already arrived outside the city. The moment he approached the city, he felt countless invisible gazes suddenly locking onto him from the void. It was as if countless people were watching him at this moment. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan not understand that this city was not like an ordinary city where he could do whatever he wanted? There were countless restrictions on a cultivator of his level. Although he wanted to make a name for himself on the mainland, it did not mean that he wanted to stir up some chaos. Hence, although he sensed that there were no living beings in the city that could compare to him, he did not force his way through. Instead, he pondered for a while before landing at the city gate. The city was huge and majestic. It emitted a powerful aura that shook one's heart. All living beings, including a Tao integration expert like Luo Fan, seemed rather insignificant in front of this city. Of course, this was only in terms of aura. It did not mean that Luo Fan could not compare to this city. There were hundreds of thousands of living beings in the city. The weakest living beings among them were innate Zenith Heaven Realm cultivators. Of course, the strongest living beings had only surpassed innate Zenith Heaven Realm cultivators. They had not even entered the perishing realm. In other words, no living being had become a quasi-saint yet. It was obvious. In the entire dreamland spacetime, this city was merely an insignificant one. It was equivalent to a small city in a rural area. In fact, this city did not have city walls or city gate. The entire city was enveloped in a huge array formation. This array formation was faintly discernible. Occasionally, rays of light would flash across the surface of the array formation like lightning, outlining the outline of this huge three-dimensional array formation. The city gates were some of the entrances to the array formation. This huge array formation had 9 entrances. In other words, there were 9 city gates. When Luo Fan arrived at the gate of the city, a group of soldiers greeted him, including the leader of the group. The soldier, who seemed to be the captain and was equivalent to the 8th level of the immortal realm, asked Luo Fan respectfully, "Mister, your strength far exceeds the capacity of this city. According to the sage's decree, please accept this token to restrict the strength you can display in this city." As he spoke, the captain took out a wooden tablet that was 2 fingers wide and 1 finger thick, and presented it to him. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that the gazes on him from all directions were thousands of times heavier than before. The feeling of being watched was so strong that even ordinary people could easily sense it. Luo Fan sensed it and immediately knew what was going on. Clearly, the various existences in the city that protected the city from the destruction of powerful creatures were on guard against him, preventing him from turning hostile and attacking. In order to enter the city in front of him, Luo Fan had to limit the power he could exert so that he could not destroy the city. This kind of thing was something that Luo Fan would never agree to. However, he heard something from the soldier that he was very concerned about. That was the sage's decree. The sage's decree, as the name suggested, should be a rule set by the sage. If one did not want to go against the sage personally, they had to abide by it. This was something that made Luo Fan feel apprehensive. Apart from that, the appearance of a sage's decree. But it confirmed his guess. There was indeed a sage in this dream world. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan changed his original thoughts and carefully sensed the token. The token was 2 fingers wide and 1 finger thick, and there was a strange and complicated character engraved on its surface. This character emitted an indescribable power, causing Luo Fan to feel that his perception seemed to be suppressed, and his perception became sluggish. However, even if that was the case, he could still clearly understand the words engraved on the surface of the token. It was the word saint in saint. This is interesting. With a thought, he became quite interested in the token. He raised his hand and waved. The token left the soldier's grasp and flew to him, landing in his hand. At this moment, the token suddenly shone with a brilliant light, enveloping the space around him. It made him feel that if he wanted to move, to unleash his power, to unleash his senses, and to do anything, he would have to expend many times more energy than before. After a slight calculation, he realized that the power he could unleash was only an insignificant small portion. It could only surpass the cultivation of an innate zenith heaven, but it was not enough for him to enter the annihilation realm. This power was enough for him to not be inferior to anyone in this small city, but he could not do whatever he wanted. He was still restricted by the power in this city. The moment he took the token, the feeling of being spied on instantly disappeared. The gaze that had been locked onto him and guarded against him seemed to have never appeared. It disappeared without a trace. Obviously, the power that was guarding against him had shifted its attention away from Luo Fan. Obviously, it thought that Luo Fan would not be in danger if he was willing to take the token. When the soldier who presented the wooden token saw Luo Fan's reaction, he could not help but sigh in relief. He said, "Thank you for your understanding. Perhaps you understand what I'm about to say, but I have to say it because of my duty. As long as you step into this city, this token will naturally fuse with your body. Unless your life is in danger, it will not leave your body. However, as long as you leave this city, it will naturally leave your body, and you can give it up at will. I wish you a pleasant day." As he spoke, the group of soldiers bowed to Luo Fan, and then they parted to welcome Luo Fan into the city. Luo Fan faintly smiled and didn't mind. He waved his hand and stepped into the city gate. As expected, the wooden token fused with his body the moment he stepped into the city, and a complicated and profound saint character was left on his palm. As soon as he entered the city, in front of him was an extremely prosperous city. Luo Fan casually pulled a passerby over and asked where he could find a place like a library in this city. Luo Fan came here to understand the general knowledge and history of this dream world. Although it was only a dream world, as a dream world of intermediate stage sage to be, it was impossible for this dream world to appear abruptly. It must have had a long history that could be justified and completely explained. And in this history, he could see the way of thinking of intermediate sage to be, and thus explore more secrets of the dream world. He could more easily comprehend the true principles of this dream world, and then find the owner of this dream world. This was not a secret. The strength that Luo Fan displayed was so powerful. Although his strength had been restricted by the decree of the saint, he was still the strongest in this city. Compared to an ordinary Grand Luo realm passerby, he was naturally unimaginably powerful. Therefore, Luo Fan soon found the city's book collection hall, a place like a library. After throwing the passerby aside, Luo Fan looked at the various sights of this city as he walked towards the book collection hall. The sights of this city were very different from those of ordinary cities, but in essence there was no difference. Compared to ordinary cities, the differences were the manifestations of different occupations, different architectural styles, and various powers. Looking at all these fantastical, fairyland-like scenes, Yi Zichen's heart skipped a beat. Luo Fan soon arrived at the book collection hall, which was close to the center of the city. When he saw this book collection hall, Luo Fan knew that intermediate sage to be instinctively attached great importance to the inheritance of knowledge. This was because the book collection hall could be said to be the sturdiest and most imposing building in the entire city. Moreover, it was located in the center of the city. If it was not for the importance of the inheritance of knowledge, such a situation would not have occurred. This book collection hall did not have any restrictions on entry and exit. Anyone could enter and leave at will. Naturally, no one stopped Luo Fan when he entered. When he stepped into the book collection hall, he saw a huge, spacious hall. At this moment, there were only a few sparse figures in the great hall. They were either pacing around or hurrying past. No one was there to stop for a moment. After passing through the main hall, there were many storage rooms. The shelves were filled with books, and it was obvious that they were not ordinary books. Auras were emitted from them, allowing any living beings who saw these books to sense how precious the principles contained in them were. It seems that I have to waste a lot of time on this. Luo Fan sighed, picked a room at random, and stepped into it. This was the dreamland of the intermediate stage sage to be. Apart from the books about history and general knowledge that were necessary for the construction of this dreamland, the other books could be said to be books from the intermediate stage sage to be's memory. In other words, the knowledge in these books should be knowledge from the intermediate stage sage to be's memory. If Luo Fan could distinguish the knowledge that had been distorted by the dreamland, then reading these books would be no different from reading the intermediate stage sage to be's memory. This situation was better than he had expected. He had expected that there wouldn't be too many books, and even if there were many, most of the books would only be ordinary books that didn't contain any power. In that case, he would only be able to obtain all kinds of general knowledge about this dreamland or the cultivation system that the intermediate stage sage to be had imagined. However, at this moment, Luo Fan clearly knew from the aura that these books exuded that most of these books were not only related to the dreamland. Most of them were truly related to the earth and the universe. In other words, they were directly copied from the memory of the medium sage to be. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to understand the intermediate stage sage to be, he would no longer need to go through the construction of this dreamland to make countless deductions and conjectures before he could be sure. He could directly see it through the records in these books. In the following month, Luo Fan spent his time in the book collection hall. There were more than 1 million books in this collection. Although the number of words in each book varied, with the largest having millions of words, the smallest only having a few hundred words. However, no matter how uneven the number of words was, it was impossible for an ordinary person to read all of them. It would be impossible for an ordinary person to finish reading them in less than 1 million days, which was equivalent to thousands of years. But Luo Fan was not an ordinary person. Of course, he wasn't an ordinary person. Ordinary people would need thousands of years to finish reading millions of books, but he only took a short month to finish reading all of them. Even so, this speed was already extremely slow for him. If he wanted to speed up, he could even directly finish reading these millions of books in the time of a single breath and firmly memorize them without missing a single one. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan did not pursue speed. He wasn't just reading and memorizing these books. Instead, he treated each book in a more detailed way than an ordinary expert. He analyzed them. He deciphered them so that he could find out the secrets behind these books, as well as the thoughts and memories of the intermediate stage sage-to-be who created this dreamland. It was because of these more complicated things that he could read for a whole month. Only then did he finish reading these millions of books. And the result of reading these millions of books was quite gratifying. At the very least, at this moment, Luo Fan had all kinds of knowledge about this dreamland, the cultivation system of this dreamland, and even the cultivation method of the intermediate stage sage-to-be behind this dreamland. Although it was not complete, he could barely say that he understood it. This dreamland was a boundless continent. On this continent, in the boundless sky, lived 4 supreme sages. These 4 sages were Sage Yuan Luo, Sage Huang Long, Sage Judgment, and Sage Heartless. Among them, the one who created this world was the supreme great god Bo Gu. Back then, great god Bo Gu was in a state of chaos. He stepped on the ground and split open the earth. With a push of his hands, he created the sky. When he opened his mouth and breathed out, rivers and seas appeared. When he stared, the sun and moon appeared. In the end, after great god Bo Gu split open the world, he left the world he created and headed deep into the chaos, disappearing without a trace. After that, Sage Yuan Luo, the great god Bo Gu left behind, cultivated a supreme magic power and created humans according to great god Bo Gu's appearance. It made the world more prosperous and lively. Over the next few trillion years, Sage Huang Long, Sage Judgment, and Sage Heartless were born one after another. Together with Sage Yuan Luo, they taught and taught, forming an extremely prosperous cultivation civilization. Thus, the living beings in this world kept evolving. In the end, even the newly born living beings had the strength of a connate zenith heaven. This allowed the world to evolve and become a supreme immortal realm that was tens of thousands of times stronger than before. After that, because the 4 sages wanted to maintain the harmony of the world, they created the Sage Decree. This caused every human city to be under the protection of the Sage Decree. No matter how strong the living beings were, as long as they were not sages, they could not display strength that surpassed the strongest person in the city. According to the records in the books, the Sage Decree had appeared hundreds of billions of years ago. After reading the history of this world from the books, Luo Fan could only smile bitterly. This kind of history was really too ideal. There were too many loopholes that he could find. There were so many that he did not know where to start. However, when he thought about the state of this world at this moment, and when he thought about how the weakest living being in this world actually possessed the strength of a golden immortal realm cultivator, Luo Fan had no choice but to admit that only a world that had too many loopholes, too many coincidences, and too many idealized histories could be justified. As for the cultivation system of this world, it was not much different from that of the Earth's universe. There were also countless types of cultivation and countless methods to attain the Tao. Among them, there were Golden Core Tao, Martial Tao, Spacetime Tao, 5 Elements Tao, Formation Tao, External Alchemy Tao, and many other types of cultivation methods that existed in the Earth's universe. However, it might be due to the limitation of the strength of the intermediate stage of Sage-to-be. Apart from the Tao of Formation, almost all the other Tao of cultivation only had the most detailed information about the innate Grand Luo realm. After the innate Grand Luo realm, the cultivation method of the Sage-to-be realm was usually just hearsay. There was no definite cultivation method at all. Only the Tao of formations was incomparably detailed. From the beginning of cultivation for ordinary people all the way to the saint realm, every realm was clearly described. The characteristics of every realm and the taboos of every realm were not left out. Of course, this was only a small city, so the knowledge recorded in the books did not contain too many secrets. At least, there were not too many true cultivation methods. Even though the description of the formation Tao was clearer and more detailed, there were not too many formations in it. As a result, Luo Fan was still doubtful about whether this Tao of array was the cultivation Tao of sage to be. Although he had some confidence, he still had to wait for more conditions to support it in the future before he could truly confirm it. Unfortunately, although the description of the realms above the intermediate sage to be is very clear, and even the method of becoming a sage to be is revealed, it is just a fantasy. If we take it seriously, we will be courting death. Luo Fan sighed as he held the most precious book in the book collection hall. Welcome. Your support is my greatest motivation. Mail Disco, first. For the latest and fastest chapters, please log in. Reading is a pleasure. I suggest you collect it. Chapter 9:15. The reason why Luo Fan had such an idea was that he had a considerable understanding of the realms above the intermediate sage to be. He was even aware of the sage technique. However, the things recorded in those books were different from what he knew. Given his confidence in himself, he naturally suspected that those techniques were just the imagination of the intermediate sage to be and not the real ones. In addition, there was another more important reason. That was, if these detailed techniques were the real ones, how could this sage to be still be an intermediate sage to be? He should have reached the great accomplishment realm or the peak realm long ago. Even if he could not become a sage, he should not be far from it. Obviously, this was not the case. The intermediate sage to be was still in the intermediate realm, which was equivalent to the Tao integration expert. He had only cut off the two separations and could only enjoy the mysteries of being a sage in his dream. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan really believe in these techniques? However, this did not mean that Luo Fan could not benefit from the cultivation techniques in the dream world. On the contrary, the benefits he could obtain in this dream world would be unimaginable. There was no other reason. Although the intermediate sage to be's cultivation realm was the same as the Tao integration experts, it was equivalent to the Tao integration experts' peak, which was only one step away from breaking through and becoming a transcendent expert. In other words, at this moment, Luo Fan's cultivation realm was only close to the minor accomplishment realm of Tao integration. There were still 3 small realms between him and the intermediate sage to be who had created the dream world, namely the minor accomplishment, the great accomplishment, and the consummation. Clearly, apart from the fact that he could not understand the various cultivation methods in the dream world created by the intermediate stage of quasi-sage, everything below his cultivation realm was the same as what he had comprehended in the depths of his memory. In other words, Luo Fan could make use of the various techniques, mysteries, and principles of this dream world. He could raise his cultivation realm to the same level as the intermediate sage to be. In other words, he could raise his cultivation realm to the consummation realm of Tao integration. If such a harvest wasn't considered great, what else could be considered great? All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan already had a rather deep understanding of this fact. He could not help but reveal a faint smile on his face. With a thought, Luo Fan put down the book that described the principles of array Tao. He turned around and left the library hall. When he stepped out of the library hall, the captain of the soldiers who had stopped him when he entered the city had been waiting there for a long time. The moment he saw him, he immediately came up and bowed. "Mister, please wait a moment. The lord of the city is currently waiting for you in the city lord's mansion. I hope that Mister will not be stingy." When Luo Fan heard this, he could not help but chuckle. He could roughly guess what the city lord was going to say. However, he also had some matters to discuss with the city lord, so he didn't decline and said, "Fine. Just lead the way." The captain of the soldiers was nervous. When he suddenly heard Luo Fan agree, he could not help but be overjoyed and quickly said, "Thank you, mister." As he spoke, he led Luo Fan across several streets and arrived at the entrance of the city lord's mansion. When they arrived, they saw two groups of soldiers lined up at the entrance of the city lord's mansion. A middle-aged man who had surpassed the connate zenith heaven but had yet to perish was standing between the two groups of soldiers. He seemed to be waiting for something. When Luo Fan saw this middle-aged man, he saw through him and knew that he must be the city lord of this city. As expected, when the middle-aged man saw Luo Fan, he hurriedly came forward and bowed. "Thank you for coming, senior. I am the city lord of this city. My name is Zhang Yuan. Please forgive me for not going out to welcome you." The city lord, Zhang Yuan, placed himself in a very low position. He was even more respectful to Luo Fan than the captain of the soldiers. When the captain of the soldiers saw the city lord acting like this, his expression changed slightly. However, it was not because he felt embarrassed that his city lord had placed himself in such a low position. Instead, he was panicking because he had been so disrespectful to Luo Fan before, and even twice in a row. "There's no need to be so polite. I've taken the liberty to come here and put you in a difficult position, City Lord Zhang," said Luo Fan with a smile. The city lord hurriedly shook his head and said, "It's my fault for not being a good host. Senior has been here for a month, but I haven't gone to greet you. Although it's because I was worried that I would disturb Senior's reading, it's still inexcusable." Luo Fan chuckled and said, "There's no need to be so courteous. Since we've met, I have something to ask you, City Lord Zhang." The city lord hurriedly said, "If there's anything I can help you with, Senior, just tell me. However, this is the entrance. Why don't you come in with me and sit down before we talk?" "All right." Luo Fan was naturally indifferent. He replied and followed Zhang Yuan into the city lord's mansion. The two squads of guards also followed them in, leaving only two soldiers at the door to guard it. The city lord's mansion was quite grand, and it exuded an aura similar to the entire city. Evidently, it had an extremely close and mysterious connection with the city. The structure of the entire city lord's mansion was like a garden. Once one entered, there was a garden with a rockery, a small stream, and all kinds of strange flowers and plants. After the garden, there was a large reception hall with various rooms on both sides. Zhang Yuan led Luo Fan into the reception hall. After some politeness, the city lord finally said, "I've invited Senior here because I have a presumptuous request. I wonder if Senior can allow me to speak first." Looking at his appearance, Luo Fan knew that his previous guess was 70 to 80% true. Otherwise, the city lord would not have been so anxious to voice out his request before Zhou Bao had the chance to speak. However, Zhou Bao did not care. No matter when he said it, his decision would not change. Therefore, he just nodded and signaled for Zhang Yuan to speak. He did not tell him not to waste his time. When Zhang Yuan saw Luo Fan's reaction, a trace of disappointment appeared in his eyes. Apparently, he knew that things would not go as he wished. However, he still cheered himself up and said, "I have been the city lord of this city for more than 30,000 years. I feel that it is difficult for me to improve my strength after coming here, and this has limited the future of this city. Senior is a sage to be expert. You're billions of times stronger than me. I'm willing to give the position of city lord to Senior. I hope Senior can accept it." Zhang Yuan stood up and was about to kneel before Luo Fan. When Luo Fan heard this, he realized that it was just as he had guessed. Zhang Yuan really wanted to invite him to be the city lord. He sighed and waved his hand. No matter how hard Zhang Yuan tried, He couldn't kneel down and his face turned red. His body was as straight as a block of wood. At this moment, Luo Fan's power had been suppressed by the sage's decree to the same level as that of City Lord Zhang Yuan. The power of his magical powers could not surpass that of City Lord Zhang Yuan. However, he was a Dao integration stage cultivator, after all. A Dao integration stage cultivator's control over their power, their knowledge of the great Dao, and their understanding of power were extremely profound. Zhang Yuan was no match for them. Therefore, even though his strength and might were not stronger than Zhang Yuan's, Luo Fan was still able to restrain Zhang Yuan with ease. He couldn't kneel down. It was even to the extent that the strength he'd utilized during this entire process was merely an insignificant trace. Not to mention himself, it was practically a negligible amount of strength when compared to Zhang Yuan. Zhang Yuan had worked hard for a long time, but he knew that the difference in strength between him and the senior in front of him was too great. Unless he completely fell out with him and used the power of the city to fight against him, he would never be able to kneel down again. He couldn't help but sigh and bow instead. Seeing that Zhang Yuan was still unwilling to give up, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "I don't want to be the city lord. I already expected this, but I still hoped that I would get lucky. I've made a fool of myself in front of you, senior." Zhang Yuan sighed helplessly. The reason why Zhang Yuan insisted on inviting Luo Fan to be the city lord was very simple. It was because of the rules in the Dreamland. In the Dreamland, due to the existence of the sage's decree, no cultivator in any city could display power or magical powers that surpassed the city lords. Even a peak sage-to-be was not an exception. Under such circumstances, the cultivation level of the city lord was the greatest restriction on the development of the city. After all, no cultivator would like to use the sage's decree to suppress one's cultivation level. It could even be said that this was a form of humiliation and torture for most cultivators. Therefore, the result was very obvious. In any city, there were very few cultivators who surpassed the city lord's cultivation level. In other words, a small city like the one in front of them would rarely have a sage-to-be cultivator. As such, if the living beings in the city had the ambition to surpass the city lord, they would naturally have to leave the city and head to other cities to seek the Tao and become a disciple. As such, a city with a powerful city lord would become stronger due to the continuous influx of talented people. On the other hand, a city with a weaker city lord, such as the small city in front of them, would become weaker due to the loss of talented people. As the small city grew weaker, there would be fewer and fewer people with powerful cultivation. On the other hand, the city lord who had lost contact with cultivators of the same level would have a harder time improving his cultivation. In the end, it would be even harder for the city lord to grow stronger and lose more talented people, forming a vicious cycle. Under such circumstances, a city lord whose affection for the city surpassed his ambition would want a stronger cultivator to replace him as the city lord. Moreover, this would not only be beneficial to the city lord, but also to the city lord himself. After all, the city lord was stronger than him. As long as the city lord gave him some pointers, his cultivation would naturally improve by a lot. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that Zhang Yuan would make such a request. The reason why he was so eager to interrupt Luo Fan's words and make such a request first was self-evident. It was obviously impossible for Luo Fan to take the initiative to become the city lord of this small city. Therefore, what he told him could only be related to other cities, or some secrets that only the city lord knew. As long as he said these things, it would mean that he wanted to leave this place. How could he make a request to stay and become the city lord? After letting out a sigh, Zhang Yuan's expression became somewhat dazed. When Luo Fan saw Zhang Yuan's expression, he could not help but sigh. He knew that Zhang Yuan definitely had deep feelings for this small city, which was why he was so concerned about Luo Fan's rejection of his request. As his thoughts spun, he changed his original thoughts and said, Originally, I wanted to ask you which city has the largest library. Zhang Yuan's eyes lit up when he heard the word originally. A glimmer of hope reappeared in his eyes. Since there was an original, it meant that things would be different now. Could it be? Senior, are you willing to be the city lord? Zhang Yuan's heart flashed with hope as he opened his mouth. No, no. Luo Fan shook his head and smiled. Hearing this, Zhang Yuan was disappointed. What you want is for the city lord's cultivation to be higher than it is now. Am I right? Luo Fan saw his disappointment and chuckled. He asked. That's right. Zhang Yuan thought of something and his eyes flashed with hope. Since that's the case, then wouldn't it be fine if I gave you some pointers and allowed your cultivation level to increase? Luo Fan said. Hearing this, Zhang Yuan's face revealed a look of disbelief, and he was tongue-tied. He said, That's right. At this moment, his heart was filled with indescribable joy. This kind of joy, even if Luo Fan suddenly said that he was willing to stay here to be the city lord, would not be comparable to this kind of joy. The reason was very simple. He invited Luo Fan to be the city lord was because his cultivation level could no longer increase, which limited the improvement of this city. This was because he had no other choice. In fact, he was very reluctant to give up his position as the city lord. It was only because of his feelings for this city that he suppressed his reluctance to leave, so he had no choice but to do so. And if it was as Luo Fan had said, he could give him some pointers to improve his cultivation, then not only would he not have to lose the position of the city lord, the future of the city would also be improved, and his cultivation, which had not improved for a long time, would also be improved. Compared to giving up the position of the city lord, wasn't this countless times better? How could he not be surprised? However, Zhang Yuan was a formidable existence that had surpassed the innate golden immortal realm after all, and his Tao heart was extremely firm. So even though he was pleasantly surprised, he quickly recovered from his shock and knelt down to kowtow to Luo Fan as he said, Thank you for your benevolence, Senior. Zhang Yuan will never forget Senior's great kindness. I hope that Senior can leave your name so that Zhang Yuan can remember it. Luo Fan let Zhang Yuan kneel, and only helped him up after he finished speaking. He said, It's nothing much. It's not a big favor. However, it's not difficult for you to ask for my name. When you break through the current realm, I'll tell you my name. Imparting knowledge to Luo Fan, allowing Zhang Yuan to break through to the next realm and improve his life essence was a piece of cake for Luo Fan, but for Zhang Yuan it was a shocking favor. Therefore, Luo Fan was naturally qualified to receive a bow from Zhang Yuan. Yes, Zhang Yuan will work hard to cultivate and will definitely meet Senior's requirements. I'll know Senior's name. Zhang Yuan did not dare to say too much. He could only stand up and say so. Subsequently, Luo Fan stayed in the small city called Hidden Tiger City. Moreover, he stayed there for 100 years. During these 100 years, he cultivated and comprehended the nomological laws of this dream realm. He comprehended the great Tao so that he could unleash more and more powerful divine abilities in this dream realm and better display his strength here. On the other hand, just as he had said before, he guided Zhang Yuan, allowing Zhang Yuan's cultivation level to increase steadily. During these years, he had almost completely comprehended the various laws of this world. He could vaguely sense the grand Daos and fuse his cultivation as a fusing Daos into the various profundities of this dreamscape, allowing him to completely unleash the power of a fusing Daos in this world. The results of Zhang Yuan's guidance were also quite gratifying. Zhang Yuan cultivated the most popular formation Dao in this dream realm. This method was not like what ordinary people thought, where one studied the mysteries of formation Dao like a white-haired expert. Instead, it was through constantly comprehending the mysteries of formation Dao and gradually rebuilding one's body into formation Dao. As long as the array formation that formed the body was more profound and powerful, the existence that cultivated the Tao of array formations would have a stronger body and power. Of course, this did not mean that obtaining more and more powerful formation Tao would allow one's cultivation realm to improve continuously. In fact, when one cultivated to the peak of the connate zenith heaven realm, the number and profoundness of the formation Tao that one mastered would be sufficient to cultivate the formation Tao. At that time, even if one mastered more profound, mysterious, and complicated formation Tao or even engraved more of those formation Tao on one's body, it would no longer be of any help to improve one's cultivation realm. The result of doing that would at most, make one's body and power stronger, that's all. Before meeting Luo Fan, Zhang Yuan was already at that realm. The formation Tao that he mastered and the formation Tao that transformed his body had reached the limit and reached the point where he could no longer improve his cultivation realm. Chapter 9:16. Tidying up the array was not a difficult task for Luo Fan. Even giving pointers to others was a piece of cake for him. However, this did not mean that he could make Zhang Yuan do it immediately. As a result, it took Zhang Yuan 100 years before he finally found the key to integrating the formation. He found where the tangled threads were. The moment he found the key point, Zhang Yuan's joy reached an unbelievable level. He was simply unable to control his emotions. He laughed for 3 days and 3 nights outside the city. Only after he had vented most of his emotions did he come to kowtow to Luo Fan to thank Luo Fan for his guidance. Luo Fan simply waved his hand and asked Zhang Yuan to continue with his cultivation. After all, finding the end of the thread and finding the key was just the beginning of cultivation towards the sage-to-be realm. There was still a long way to go before he could truly break through his current realm and become a sage-to-be. Comparatively speaking, it wasn't much different from cultivating from zero all the way to surpass the connate golden immortal realm. Back then, when he started cultivating from scratch, he had to constantly add arrays to his body until he could no longer add any more. But now, in order to break through the realm and become a quasi-sage, he had to integrate the array, reduce the number of arrays, and finally reduce them to a single array. It was simply a corresponding reverse process. Fortunately, Zhang Yuan was no longer an ordinary mortal, or rather, an ordinary connate Grand Luo. In this world of dreams, ordinary mortals were equivalent to connate Grand Luo. His realm was many times stronger than before. Although it was the same process, he didn't need to spend as much time as before. According to Luo Fan's calculation, it would take him at most 1,000 years to complete the process that took him tens of thousands of years to break through the current realm and step into the sage-to-be. Time in the dream world. It was completely separated from the outside world. To the outside world, the amount of time spent here was equivalent to the time taken by a mid-level sage to be sleeping. Therefore, to Luo Fan, it was a waste of 1,000 years. It was just a small matter. Of course, having said that, Luo Fan did not intend to leave until Zhang Yuan had reached the sage-to-be realm. As long as Zhang Yuan's cultivation was on the right track, he would be able to reach the sage-to-be realm without Meng Qi's guidance. Then, Meng Qi would leave this place and head to another city. He continued with the plan he had in mind. After that, another 100 years passed. On this day, the place where Zhang Yuan was cultivating in seclusion suddenly shone brightly. Countless strange lines and runes suddenly burst out of that quiet room, instantly sweeping across a radius of hundreds of miles. These lights, these lines, these runes, all of them were formed from some kind of extremely mysterious energy. This energy was extremely mysterious. It was thousands of times more powerful than the boundless innate yuan qi in the void, and it also contained some kind of extremely firm will. Clearly, the energy that formed these lights, these lines, these runes. It was the power cultivated by a cultivator. Obviously, that cultivator could only be Zhang Yuan. At this moment, Luo Fan was meditating with his eyes closed not far away. Sensing the abnormality here, He released his senses slightly and instantly understood everything. He could not help but smile faintly. Finally, the number of formations has been reduced by half. It seems that I'm really on the right track. It's almost time to leave. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, the various strange phenomena around the quiet room suddenly shrank. However, they did not shrink back into the quiet room, but directly condensed into a figure above the quiet room. The figure looked like a middle-aged man with a strong, majestic aura. As he breathed, there was an inexplicable resonance with the city. He was the city lord of Hidden Tiger City, Zhang Yuan. At this moment, Zhang Yuan's cultivation was one step closer to the realm of annihilation, which was also the Sage-to-be realm. He was more than 10 times stronger than before. Floating in the void, there was a faint power around him. Occasionally, there would be all kinds of strange runes flashing in the void around him. There were also the outlines of formations flashing and disappearing around him, illuminating him in a strange and mysterious way. With a thought, Luo Fan arrived in the air and directly floated in front of Zhang Yuan. When Zhang Yuan saw this, he quickly withdrew his aura and bowed to Luo Fan. He said, "Senior, I did not let you down. I've completed the first step of integrating the formations." Not bad. It's indeed rare and commendable to have such progress in just a short period of 200 years. Now that you've successfully taken the first step of your breakthrough, it means that you're already on the right path. There's no need for me to say anything else. Today we'll part ways here, Luo Fan said with a smile. He had stayed here for 200 years. Although he had not lost his patience, he had long felt that he had stayed here for too long. Since Zhang Yuan had broken through, he could be considered to have fulfilled his promise. Of course, there was no need for him to delay any further. That was why he suggested to leave at this moment. When Zhang Yuan heard this, his expression changed greatly. He quickly said, "Senior, why do you say that? Although I have some achievements, I'm still far from becoming a quasi-sage. Without your guidance, how could I break through? I hope Senior will be merciful and stay here for a few more days." However, Luo Fan only smiled and said, No, you're now on the right path. In the future, as long as you continue on this path, you'll naturally be able to become a quasi-sage. Moreover, all good things must come to an end. Now is the time to end." As he said this, he only smiled faintly and said, "Take care." Then, he turned into a ray of light and shot into the distance. When Zhang Yuan saw this, he turned pale with fright and hurriedly shouted, "I still don't know Senior's name. I hope Senior will leave me a memory." "My name is Luo Fan. I'm just an ordinary cultivator." As soon as he finished speaking, such a sentence came from afar and entered his ears. It was a voice that he had heard for 200 years and was extremely familiar with. Along with this voice came a token. There was also a token that was as thick as a finger and as wide as 2 hands. The word sage was written on it in a strange language. It was the sage decree. Zhang Yuan hurriedly took the token and his face turned gloomy. "So Senior is called Luo Fan. Unfortunately, my aptitude is too poor. I wasn't valued by Senior, so I couldn't become Senior Luo Fan's disciple." As such thoughts flashed through his mind, his face became even gloomier. The joy of achieving a breakthrough had already disappeared without a trace. After staring blankly for a long while, he finally descended. When he returned to the City Lord mansion, he directly set up a seat of honor for Luo Fan and worshipped him every day to show his respect. When Zhang Yuan set up a seat of honor in the mansion, Luo Fan, who was far away from Hidden Tiger City, felt an inexplicable connection coming from the direction of Hidden Tiger City, which made him feel a faint concern. With a flash of thought and a slight deduction, he knew what was going on, and he couldn't help but be at a loss whether to laugh or cry. He set up a seat of honor and worshipped him every day. This kind of behavior was a little too respectful. However, he was now tens of thousands of miles away from Hidden Tiger City. If he returned, it would be a little deliberate. What Zhang Yuan wanted to do was none of Luo Yunyang's business. Since Luo Yunyang did not suffer any losses, Luo Yunyang did not care about him. Instead, he continued to head toward his destination, which was the city closest to Hidden Tiger City. During the past 200 years, although Luo Fan had been staying in Hidden Tiger City, he had not stopped exploring the dream world. Thanks to Zhang Yuan's authority as the city lord, he had collected no less than the number of books in the dream world. He had also learned from Zhang Yuan what he had wanted to ask Zhang Yuan about, which city had the most books in the dream world. Therefore, the general direction he chose at this moment was to head towards the city with the most treasures. Luo Fan's speed was unimaginably fast. Soon, he had arrived at the city with the most books, which was the closest city to Hidden Tiger City. The style of this city was completely different from that of Hidden Tiger City. Although it was still vast and majestic, there was an additional iron-blooded charm in it. Obviously, this city was not as peaceful as Hidden Tiger City. In other words, the creatures in this city were more warlike than those in Hidden Tiger City. This was the name of this city, Bloody Battle City. This city was about twice the size of Hidden Tiger City. However, the strongest among them was only about the same as Zhang Yuan. They had only surpassed the innate Zenith Heaven realm and had not yet stepped into the Sage-to-be realm. It was precisely because their realms were similar that Bloody Battle City and Hidden Tiger City could coexist so peacefully. If there was a difference in strength between the two cities, the iron-blooded charm of Bloody Battle City would not allow Hidden Tiger City to sit quietly. Even if Bloody Battle City did not have the intention to occupy Hidden Tiger City, there would still be competition and friction between the two cities, which would eventually lead to many disputes. This Blood Battle City also didn't have any city walls. Instead, it was surrounded by a large formation. However, this formation was completely different from the Hidden Tiger City's city-protecting formation. The Hidden Tiger City's formation was exquisite, complicated, and mysterious. However, the Bloody Battle City's city-protecting formation was like a battle formation. It was rough, simple, and had a biting cold killing intent hidden within it. Occasionally, the flashing runes were blood-red, as if they were blood that could drip down at any time. Luo Fan combined all the knowledge he had gained in Hidden Tiger City and gained a deeper understanding of the nature of Bloody Battle City. When he landed at the city gate, he also felt like he was being watched, just like in Hidden Tiger City. However, unlike in Hidden Tiger City, this feeling of being watched was mixed with a strong fighting intent. It was as if the person who was spying on him had a strong desire to fight him. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did not take it seriously. By the time he reached the entrance of the formation, a strong man in battle armor had already come out to greet him with a group of soldiers. This strong man was nearly 12 feet tall. His muscles were bulging like they were made of steel and even shone with a metallic luster. As he stood there, he exuded an iron-blooded aura, as if he was facing an army of 1,000,000 soldiers. This man's aura was restrained and did not leak out at all. However, Luo Fan could tell at a glance that this man's strength surpassed that of an innate perfected Luo. Obviously, this man was the city lord of Bloody Battle City. After the city lord came out, he first cupped his hands at Luo Fan and said, "I'm the city lord of Bloody Battle City, Zhan Shui. Welcome, senior." His name was actually the reverse of Bloody Battle City's Bloody Battle. It seemed that this name was given by him after he became the city lord. "City lord, you're being too courteous. I came to Bloody Battle City just to take a look at the books in your city. I hope you can make things convenient for me, city lord." Luo Fan did not care about this. He just chuckled and said, "The books are open to everyone. Senior, you can take a look whenever you want. There's no such thing as making things convenient for you. It's just that there are rules. I hope you can bring this saint's decree with you, senior," Zhan Shui said respectfully. His voice buzzed, and it was extremely grand. There was even a hint of metal within it, which matched his name very well. Naturally, Luo Fan knew the rules. He nodded nonchalantly and said, "Of course, we'll do it according to the rules." With that said, the city lord took the sage decree handed over by his subordinate, turned around, and respectfully presented it to Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked at the city lord meaningfully. He chuckled and took the saint's decree. At that moment, his strength had been suppressed to the same level as Zhang Shui's city lord. Seeing this, Zhang Shui's eyes lit up. He said, "Senior, please." Luo Fan nodded and followed him into the city. He was directly led to the Bloody Battle City's book collection hall by the city lord. This book collection hall was roughly the same as the one in Hidden Tiger City, but the details were more unique to the Bloody Battle City. It looked very rough and had an iron-blooded charm. Luo Fan originally thought that the city lord would say something along the way and put forward his expected request, but he did not expect that the city lord would not say anything even when they reached the book collection hall. He just introduced the various characteristics of the Bloody Battle City to him. It seems that he still has some patience. Luo Fan naturally did not think that the city lord had given up on the idea. However, it did not matter to him whether he mentioned it or not, so he put it aside and directly entered the book collection hall. He began to read the various books inside the book collection hall. There were many duplicates of the book collection hall in the Hidden Tiger City, but at the same time, there were many more books that were not in the Hidden Tiger City's book collection hall. It also took Luo Fan a month to finish reading the millions of books in the book collection hall. After reading these books, he gained a new understanding of the cultivation system, history, and general knowledge of this dream world. He felt that his horizons had been broadened. Vaguely, he had a vague sense of the cultivation profundity of the mid-tier sage to be in this dream world. His cultivation realm had also loosened a little. Although he had not broken through to the minor perfection Tao integration realm, he was no longer unable to find his direction like before. This kind of harvest filled his heart with joy, and it further strengthened his original thoughts. With joy in his heart, Luo Fan finally walked out of the book collection hall a month after he stepped into it. As soon as he walked out of the book collection hall, a figure appeared at the entrance of the hall as he had expected. The person was 12 feet tall and had a strong body. He was dressed in armor and had a strong battle intent on his face. It was the city lord of the Bloody Battle City, Warblood. Warblood is bold enough to challenge Senior. "Please give me some pointers," the city lord said. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but smile. When he had first seen Warblood, Luo Fan had already guessed that he would say something like this. He had been waiting for this sentence when he had walked from the city gate to the book collection hall. He had a whole new level of respect for Warblood's patience for him to be able to hold back his words until now. Challenge? That's fine. I also want to see City Lord Warblood's battle technique. City Lord Warblood, please lead the way. They were at the entrance of the book collection hall and on the main road, so it was obviously not a good place to fight. Hence, Luo Fan said this directly. Warblood's eyes lit up when he heard Luo Fan's words. He said, "Thank you, Senior." After saying so, Warblood turned around, turned into a streak of light, and soared into the sky, shooting towards a certain location in the city. Seeing this, Luo Fan chuckled and lightly stepped forward, easily following behind Warblood. He didn't fall behind in the slightest, nor was he fast. At the same time, he and Warblood landed on a training field in the east of the city. There were originally dozens of people tempering their bodies and training their combat skills in the training field. When they saw Luo Fan and Warblood suddenly appear, they all exclaimed in surprise. Following which, without needing Warblood to say anything, Warblood's group naturally left the dojo. However, they didn't leave immediately. Instead, they stood in the distance and watched the dojo from afar. It was obvious that they didn't want to miss out on the battle that might happen next. Judging from their practiced and spontaneous behavior, It was obvious that War-Blood had done something like this many times. When War-Blood saw Luo Fan land on the ground exactly like him, the light in his eyes grew even brighter. Before he knew it, a smile filled with fighting spirit appeared on his face. He no longer concealed his aura. Instead, he released it unreservedly, sweeping out in all directions like a wave. The training field spanned hundreds of thousands of square meters, and it was divided into several thousand areas by various arrays. Outside these several thousand areas, the entire training field was enveloped by a huge array. At this moment, none of the arrays that divided the training field into several thousand areas were activated. Only the largest array, which enveloped the entire training field, flickered with a faint light, protecting the entire training field. When War-Blood released his aura without holding back, the array that enveloped the training field flashed brightly, directly isolating the path of his aura and limiting it to the inside of the training field. Chapter 9:17. It felt great to watch it without any advertisements. Although the aura exuded by War-Blood's City Lord seemed to be spreading out casually, it contained an extremely subtle profundity. The aura was reflected by the power of the defensive formation around the training field, forming an extremely mysterious domain inside the training field. This domain was completely formed by the City Lord's aura. The space, time, and laws within it were completely changed and distorted by the presence of the aura. Therefore, if one was not careful, it was easy to overlook this domain and think that it was just an ordinary pressure. However, it was impossible for Luo Fan to overlook it. He saw through it at a glance, which was why he was so impressed. This domain was extremely mysterious. Everything within it seemed to be under the control of War-Blood City Lord. Every breath of War-Blood City Lord seemed to affect the composition of time and space within it. This is the so-called blood battle domain, right? Luo Fan said with a faint smile. War-Blood City Lord's eyes shone even brighter when he heard Luo Fan's words. He laughed and said, "Senior is really knowledgeable." "That's right. This is the inheritance domain of our Blood Battle City, the Blood Battle Domain. Although it's not a secret, very few cultivators know that the Blood Battle Domain is in such a form. War-Blood is really impressed that Senior can see through it." As he spoke, the surrounding aura shook violently and suddenly evolved into countless strange shadows. Thousands of phantoms of gigantic exotic beasts condensed out of thin air and appeared around War-Blood, circling around him and staring at Luo Fan from afar. It seemed as if these exotic beasts would pounce on Luo Fan at any moment. Luo Fan had visited 2 cities and memorized all the books recorded in the libraries of the 2 cities. Naturally, he was quite familiar with the general knowledge of the dream world. He had learned about the Blood Battle City's Blood Battle Domain from those libraries. Moreover, the thousands of exotic beasts that appeared around Bloodbath City Lord were no secret to him. He only glanced at them. He instantly learned what each exotic beast was called, and what kind of special abilities they had. Among these abilities there were strong and weak ones, but not all of them belonged to those powerful exotic beasts. Obviously, these exotic beasts were not randomly chosen, nor were they chosen by Battle Blood City Lord based on the strength of his beast. Instead, they were combined according to some strange laws and were in accordance with some mysterious principles. However, even though Luo Fan had seen through all of this, it did not mean that he knew exactly what kind of pattern it was, and what kind of mysteries it formed. After all, this was the first time he had come into contact with the Blood Battle Domain, the first time he had come into contact with such a mysterious battle technique. This kind of combat technique is obviously not something that the intermediate sage-to-be came up with out of thin air. It seems to contain a deeper mystery. Perhaps I can gain more insight from it. Such a thought suddenly flashed across Luo Fan's mind. When this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan became much more serious. His eyes were no longer as calm as before. Instead, they had become much more solemn. The radiance within them had also become much brighter. At this moment, War Blood City Lord did not continue to wait. He had always addressed Luo Fan as a senior, which naturally meant that he was a junior. How could a junior just stand there and wait for a senior to attack? The first to attack would naturally be him, not Luo Fan. After he shouted to be careful, his body trembled, and the countless lights around him suddenly gathered around him. The thousands of strange beasts changed their forms and shone with different colors of light. They melted and merged into one, directly condensing into a humanoid figure on the body of the city lord of War Blood City. This humanoid shadow was around 10 meters tall. It looked dazzling, and the aura of power merged with the power within War Blood City Lord's body. It broke through the limit and reached a level that could only be reached by the Annihilation Realm. After the humanoid shadow was formed, War Blood City Lord suddenly pounced towards Luo Fan with the shadow. He spread his arms wide and moved slightly in the air. Time and space seemed to have undergone strange changes during this process. It was as if they had suddenly become a little out of sync. His light figure also became a little illusory, as if it was intermittent, appearing and disappearing at times. I see. Luo Fan's eyes lit up as he saw the secret behind it. The exotic beasts chosen by the Blood Battle Zone were able to cooperate with each other and merge into one in the end. This allowed all of the exotic beasts' power to be completely unleashed. Then, the power within War Blood City Lord's body underwent a qualitative change, reaching a level that surpassed his own strength. Such a divine ability was indeed worthy of the famous Blood Battle Zone. It was a pity that its usage was limited. If it could be used at any time and place without the need to rely on the formation around the training field, Blood Battle City would definitely have achieved more than what it was now. However, this was still nothing to him. Although the power of his divine ability had been limited to the same level as War Blood City Lord, he was still a Dao integration cultivator after all. His cultivation realm and insight were many times greater than War Blood City Lord's. His use of power, the use of rules and laws, as well as the ability to change time and space were not something that War Blood City Lord could compare to. Even though War Blood City Lord had used the Blood Battle Zone to raise the power of his divine ability to a level that could only be reached by the Annihilation Realm, his essence was still in the Annihilation Realm. His control of power and the ability to change time and space were far inferior to Luo Fan's. Therefore, in the face of such an attack, Luo Fan did not show any panic on his face. With a slight thought, his figure turned illusory. Then, he gently took a step to the side and calmly dodged the powerful attack from War Blood City Lord and the illusory figure that could tear apart time and space and destroy the world. War Blood City Lord saw Luo Fan's every move clearly and even saw every principle and mystery that Luo Fan used. However, no matter how he changed, he found that he could not hit Luo Fan at all and could only slip past him. Luo Fan smiled and said, "Although the power of the Blood Battle Zone is powerful, it is not your own power after all. When you can use the Blood Battle Zone without the help of the surrounding formation, you will be able to perfectly control every trace of power that comes with it." As he spoke, he put his finger together and gently poked at a strange intersection on the illusory figure. Although the illusory figure could gather the power of War Blood City Lord and condense a power that surpassed his own level, reaching the Annihilation Realm. However, the illusory figure was formed from thousands of exotic beasts. Even if these exotic beasts had all sorts of mysterious powers and their condensing methods were indescribably exquisite, it was impossible for them to truly be one. There were bound to be some gaps, and there were still some differences. Of course, these gaps were extremely small. It was not an existence like Luo Fan. It would be difficult for him to notice it and use the same method. The power that Luo Fan used in this poke was insignificant compared to War Blood City Lord. It was not even comparable to the power of any living beings in this world. In other words, it was far weaker than the power of Khanate Grand Luo cultivators. However, the effect it produced was earth-shattering. At this instant, the entire illusory figure suddenly exploded and turned into countless tiny fragments. In the process, these fragments continued to explode and eventually turned into powder. It formed a faint mist that enveloped War-Blood City Lord's body. At this instant, War-Blood City Lord felt an indescribable pain from the depths of his soul. That kind of pain was as if his spirit was crumbling into countless tiny fragments. Then, the mist spread in all directions and engulfed the entire training field. Crackling sounds could be heard in the void of the martial arts field. In the blink of an eye, it had completely disappeared. The formation around the martial arts field had lost its light, and the void in the martial arts field had also returned to its original clarity. It was as if the challenge had never happened. Only War-Blood City Lord knelt on the ground with his hands pressed against the ground. His head hung low and there was a pool of sweat that was getting bigger and bigger under his body. "Thank you for your guidance, Senior. If I achieve anything in the future, it will be thanks to you today." War-Blood City Lord's hoarse voice was suddenly heard. His words sounded like he was holding a grudge after losing the battle and declaring that he would take revenge in the future. However, Luo Fan could hear sincerity and gratitude in his words. Clearly, these words were not a declaration of revenge. Instead, they were genuine gratitude that came from the bottom of War-Blood City Lord's heart. In the face of such words, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "My methods were rough. I'll be happy if you don't hold a grudge." War-Blood City Lord hurriedly endured his exhaustion and pain. He raised his head and bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Senior, why do you say that? If you hadn't completely removed the mark that the formation left in my body, I wouldn't have been able to completely abandon the formation and use the blood battlefield. My cultivation would have been forever limited to this level. How would I dare to hold a grudge?" War-Blood City Lord was born and grew up in Blood Battle City. To him, Blood Battle City was his everything. It was precisely because of this that he was able to cultivate the blood battlefield of Blood Battle City to such a superb level. He was able to unleash its power to the limit, allowing him to unleash the divine ability that only existences at the exterminator level could unleash under the circumstances that he had only broken through to the innate Grand Luo realm but had not become an exterminator. However, it was precisely because he had come into contact with the blood battlefield too early that he had cultivated it too deeply that the blood battlefield had left a deep mark in the depths of his body. Aside from allowing him to use the blood battle domain with greater ease, the brand also restricted him to the blood battle domain. He was unable to break free from the shackles of the blood battle domain. As a result, his cultivation was limited to his current level, and he could not break through. The reason for this was very simple. The blood battlefield of Blood Battle City could only be used with the help of the formation around the training field. Although this formation was not necessarily limited to this martial arts field and could be set up in other places, it was already an external object. In other words, leaving the mark of the blood battlefield in his body was equivalent to leaving the mark of an external object in his body. If the living beings in this world were not born as innate Grand Luo realm and had such a mark, he would not have been able to become an innate Grand Luo realm. How could he have become an exterminator or a demi-saint with such a mark? Luo Fan's poke just now not only broke the shadow and the blood battlefield, but it also broke the mark of the blood battlefield that was contained in his body. In this way, he would not be able to use the blood battlefield in the future, but he would also be free from the shackles on his body. He had broken the barrier that prevented him from improving his cultivation. How could he not be grateful? How could he not be happy? Ha ha! Luo Fan laughed when he heard the city lord's words and helped him up. "Since you don't blame me, I'm relieved. I believe you should be able to form the blood battlefield if you cultivate the battle technique to its peak, right? Senior's eyes are like torches. When I first took over the city lord's position, I was too impatient because my strength was not enough to convince others. I took the shortcut. Although I will regret it in the future, it is already too late to change. The city lord said in shame. Now that you have gotten rid of the shackles, you only need to cultivate the battle technique in the future, and you will naturally break through and become a demi-saint. Your future is limitless. Luo Fan chuckled and said, Thanks to Senior's guidance today, I have already lost beyond redemption. I do not dare to offend Senior, but I hope that Senior will do me the favor and visit me. Let me serve you wine as a token of my gratitude. The city lord said after saying that he did not dare. Luo Fan shook his head and said, I want to go to Wisdom Victory City. I came to Blood Battle City just to see the many books in the library hall. Now that the matter is over, it is not good for me to stay. Senior, why are you leaving so quickly? I don't even know Senior's name. If I let Senior leave just like that, how am I going to face others? The city lord was shocked and quickly said, As a cultivator, why are you so long-winded? I will go. Luo Fan laughed. He lifted his foot and turned into a rainbow. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared in front of Battle Blood City Lord. The city lord was extremely grateful towards Luo Fan. Although he was extremely reluctant to see Luo Fan leave, he wanted to ask him to stay and learn from him. He wanted to keep Luo Fan and ask him for advice, but he didn't dare to stop him. He could only watch Luo Fan leave in disappointment. Not long after, another ray of light flew towards the city lord from afar. The city lord sensed where the light came from and found that it was coming from the direction where Luo Fan left. He couldn't help but be overjoyed, thinking that Luo Fan had returned. He quickly went to greet him. However, in the blink of an eye, the light landed in front of him and stopped. It was a token that was 1 finger thick and 2 fingers wide. There was a strange word, Saint, engraved on it. It was the Saint Decree. Obviously, after Luo Fan left the bloody battle city, the Saint Decree left his body and was directly sent back by him. Along with the Saint Decree there was a sentence. You and I are fated to meet, so I will leave my name for you to know. I am just an ordinary cultivator, and my name is Luo Fan. Remember it. The city lord took the Saint Decree and listened to Luo Fan's voice transmission. A look of disappointment appeared on his face. So, this is Senior's name. With this thought in mind, he turned into a ray of light and returned to his city lord mansion in the blink of an eye. His city lord's mansion was different from the Hidden Tiger City Lord's mansion. The Hidden Tiger City Lord's mansion was like a garden, while the Bloody Battle City's City Lord's mansion was like a military camp. The interior of the building was very flat and square, exuding an iron-blooded aura. After Warblood's City Lord landed in the City Lord's mansion, he summoned the Deputy City Lord and said, Send out all the city's scouts to other cities on the continent. Their main targets are the thousands of cities along the route from our city to Wisdom City. Yes. The Deputy City Lord quickly said, But what is their mission? Their mission is very simple. Inquire about a senior named Luo Fan, a sage-to-be. It's best if they can find out where Senior Luo Fan has been and where he is now. After that, report back to me, the City Lord said without hesitation. The Deputy City Lord quickly agreed with a solemn expression. Then, he went to arrange the manpower. Not long after, rays of light shot out from Bloody Battle City in all directions, spreading across the mainland at an unimaginable speed. Senior Luo Fan, although this junior has no fate to ask for guidance from you, at least I should know where Senior is. If I have any doubts in the future, I can go to Senior for guidance. Such a thought flashed in Blood War City Lord's mind. That's right. The purpose of sending so many scouts to other cities was to learn about Luo Fan's whereabouts. Although this seemed to offend Luo Fan, in order to know where Luo Fan was, he had no choice but to do so in order to find someone to ask if he had any doubts in the future. Just as the city lord ordered the scouts to go to many cities to gather information, Luo Fan, who had already arrived in another city, sensed something and could not help but smile bitterly. This War-Blood and Zhang Yuan have completely different personalities. Their methods are also completely different. But that's fine. This method coincides with my goal, so I'll let him be, he thought. Luo Fan's most important goal in stopping in these two cities was to read books. This was because many of the secrets of this dreamscape were recorded in those books. Reading these books and comprehending these secrets would allow him to have a better understanding of this dreamscape. At the same time, he would also gain a better understanding of the intermediate sage-to-be who created this dreamscape, thereby increasing his chances of defeating that intermediate sage-to-be in the future. And the reason he stopped in these two cities and gave pointers to the two city lords was naturally not because he was a benevolent person or a good teacher. Instead, it was to make a name for himself. In order to use these city lords to spread his name, he wanted to at least become a celebrity in this dreamscape. Mail sign for the latest and fastest chapters, please log in. Reading is a pleasure. I suggest you bookmark it. Chapter 9:18. It was so cool to watch it without any advertisements. In this world, nothing was easier to become famous than a cultivator with an extremely high cultivation realm who was good at teaching others. After all, to any living being in this world, improving one's cultivation was something that was close to an instinctive pursuit. To them, the existence of such a cultivator was the hope of improving one's cultivation realm. Under such circumstances, they would definitely try their best to find out information about this cultivator. When they inquired like this, they naturally spread Luo Fan's reputation even faster from another angle. As his reputation spread, his influence would naturally increase. As his influence increased, the intermediate sage-to-be who had created this dream world would discover his existence and take the initiative to look for Luo Fan. This would save him the trouble of searching for this intermediate sage-to-be among the countless living creatures. Next, Luo Fan acted according to his plan. There were thousands of cities on the way from Hidden Tiger City to Wisdom City. Most of these cities were like Hidden Tiger City and Bloody Battle City. The most powerful city lords were only beyond the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm, but they were not at the level of the Exterminator. Only a very small number of city lords had reached the level of the Exterminator. In other words, only a very small number of city lords were equivalent to the sage-to-be realm. Among these city lords who were above the Exterminator level, only a very small number of city lords had surpassed the Exterminator level and reached the level of the Transcendent realm. In other words, they had at least one corpse. Among them, there were only one or two city lords who had severed two corpses and were equivalent to the Tao integration realm. As for those who were above the Tao integration realm, in other words, there were no existences that surpassed Luo Fan. Among these city lords, apart from the cultivators who were equivalent to the Tao integration realm, Luo Fan was qualified to give pointers to any other cultivator. And that was exactly what he did. Luo Fan was also qualified to communicate with the city lords who were equivalent to the Tao integration realm. In this way, both of them would benefit a lot. Just like that, thousands of years later, when he had walked through thousands of cities, he would not be able to see anything. When he arrived at Wisdom City, the city with the largest library in the entire dream world, his name had already become a legend in this dream world. Just like that, as soon as he arrived outside Wisdom City and stepped into the range of the formation of this huge city that was hundreds of times larger than Hidden Tiger City, the city lord of Wisdom City appeared at the city gate with a smile on his face. He respectfully welcomed Luo Fan. "So it's teacher, Bai Mu didn't go out to greet you. I hope teacher can forgive me," the city lord said respectfully. Bai Mu was obviously the name of the city lord. Human teacher was a title that Luo Fan had created over the years. The reason for his fame was naturally because he was good at teaching others. Over the years, almost every city's castellan had become a city lord. They were all indebted to him. Many city lords respected him greatly, which was why they gave him such a title. Among the many city lords that Luo Fan had seen, This city lord was neither the weakest nor the strongest. From his aura, Luo Fan could easily sense that this city lord was a void comprehender. Compared to Zhang Yuan, he was only one step away from becoming a Dao-fusing expert. Compared to Zhang Yuan, he was tens of thousands of times stronger. However, compared to Luo Fan, there was still a huge gap between them. At the moment, Luo Fan's cultivation realm had unknowingly made great progress. Back then, when he had just entered the dream world, he was only a step away from initial success. At this moment, he had completely stabilized at initial success, and he had broken through a bottleneck that was neither too big nor too small. If he had continued to cultivate this bottleneck, it would have taken him at least 100,000 years to break through, even though it would have been an eternity away. It had been a rare opportunity for him to make such a breakthrough in just a few thousand years. The reason for such progress was not complicated. It was because during these thousands of years, Luo Fan had constantly read the book collections in thousands of cities. Unknowingly, he had already gained some subtle insights into the various mysteries of the middle-tier sage-to-be who had created this dreamland. It was this insight that had allowed him to break through the bottleneck of the small success realm and step into the small success realm. Of course, only the outsider, Luo Fan, could do this. For the living beings in this world, even if they studied all the book collections in this world thoroughly, they would not be able to obtain such great benefits. The cultivation realm still had to be slowly cultivated in order to ultimately improve. As an outsider, Luo Fan had a completely different worldview from the living beings in this dreamland. It was a real worldview. In the eyes of the living beings of this world, everything in this world was so real, so reasonable. They would never have thought that there were so many laws in this world. The laws were just the imagination of a powerhouse. It was impossible for them to exist in the real world. However, Luo Fan was different. In his eyes, the truth and falsehood in this dreamland were truly extended from the depths of the middle-tier sage-to-be's memory. The mysteries he had comprehended were very different from those he had casually imagined. At a glance, he knew which books were useless to him and which were directly reflected from the middle-tier sage-to-be's insight. Under such circumstances, he naturally completely eliminated all factors that could affect his comprehension of the middle-tier sage-to-be's insight. Every book he read was equivalent to comprehending a trace of the middle-tier sage-to-be's insight. Given these factors, it was not surprising that he could make such an easy breakthrough. "City Lord, you're too polite. I'm only here to read the book collections. Why do you need to welcome me?" "I'm already flattered that you're here," Luo Fan said with a smile. "Everyone knows that you're humble," the city lord said with a smile. Then, he waved his hand behind him, and a soldier presented a sage decree to him. "Although I admire you, I have to respect the sage decree. I hope you can forgive me," the soldier said as he presented the sage decree shamefully. Luo Fan had experienced this process thousands of times, so he naturally would not be dissatisfied. He smiled and said, "The sage decree cannot be disobeyed. City Lord, you're worrying too much." With that, he took the sage decree. In an instant, he felt his body being greatly suppressed. The magical power that he could exert had been reduced by many times. In the blink of an eye, he had reached the same level as the city lord. Compared to the time in Hidden Tiger City, he was suppressed to this extent. Compared to the time in Bloody Battle City, it was much better. However, it was still a great suppression for him. It still made him feel a faint sense of oppression. Fortunately, he was already completely used to it after experiencing it for thousands of times. The oppressive feeling only appeared for a moment before it was immediately dispelled. Seeing that Luo Fan took the sage decree, his expression did not change at all. White Eye City Lord and the people behind him were all delighted. Previously, they greeted Luo Fan because Luo Fan looked very similar to the legendary Ren Master, Luo Fan. Although they were respectful, it was just to be safe. They were not completely sure that this person was the Ren Master, Luo Fan. However, at this moment, seeing Luo Fan's actions and expression, they were completely sure that the person in front of them. He was definitely the Ren Master, Luo Fan. Only the Ren Master. Only the Ren Master could accept the sage decree, which limited his strength, so naturally and peacefully. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a teacher and the saint's decree was on him, his expression would definitely have changed and his aura would definitely have changed. He definitely wouldn't have acted like this. What kind of existence was the sage decree? They could not be more clear about this. Just thinking about it made them feel depressed. If they didn't want to think about it, it was easy to imagine. If he were to encounter such a situation, he would definitely be dispirited for a long time before he could adjust his state of mind. Moreover, even after he had adjusted his state of mind, he would definitely use the fastest speed to complete his task, leave the city, and escape the suppression of the sage decree. However, they would definitely not be as relaxed as Luo Fan. In their eyes, this was the most obvious evidence that the Ren Master was. Only the Ren Master could be so calm. Ren Master, please come in. Our city's book collection hall is the largest book collection hall in the entire world. Other than a few unique books from each city, almost all books can be found. White Eye City Lord eagerly brought Luo Fan into the city. As soon as he stepped into the city, Luo Fan saw where the book collection hall was. The reason was that the book collection hall was simply too huge and too tall. Just by standing at the city gate and raising his head, he could see the huge book collection hall near the center of Wisdom City. It was tens of thousands of feet tall and covered an area of a few thousand miles. The reason why he knew it was the book collection hall was because when Luo Fan looked at it, he could feel the aura of books. He had been to thousands of cities and thousands of book collection halls, but he wouldn't be fooled. As expected of Wisdom City, as expected of the largest book collection hall in the entire world. When Luo Fan saw the book collection hall that reached into the clouds, he couldn't help but exclaim in joy. White Eye City Lord revealed a proud expression when he heard Luo Fan's praise, and he said, Ren Master, there's something you don't know. This city has been built for billions of years. Since it was built, every generation of City Lord has gathered all sorts of book collection halls in the world. Even if there are some that we can't gather, we'll find a way to make copies of them and place them in the book collection hall. After billions of years of accumulation, this book collection hall was created, which other cities can't compare to. This is also the greatest pride of our city. Oh, so every generation of City Lord of your city values books so much. It's truly admirable. Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. Thank you, Ren Master. White Eye City Lord bowed towards Luo Fan with gratitude when he heard Luo Fan's words. Obviously, he was grateful that Luo Fan had praised their Wisdom City's way of doing things. In reality, even though Wisdom City was famous throughout the world for its rich collection of books, not many people approved of them from the bottom of their hearts. They only regarded the successive city lords of Wisdom City as typical examples of people who did not do their proper work. Even if they occasionally needed to visit Wisdom City, the praise was only superficial, and there was not much praise that came from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment, even though Luo Fan had only praised them, the sincerity in his words, the admiration and respect in his words made everyone feel that it came from the bottom of his heart. It made White Eye City Lord feel happy that he had been understood, which was why he thanked Luo Fan. Luo Fan chuckled and said, What's the point of thanking me? The actions of the City Lords of Wisdom City have been beneficial for generations to come. Wouldn't it be absurd if I had to be grateful just to show my admiration? White Eye City Lord couldn't help but reveal excitement in his eyes when he heard Luo Fan's words. However, he was a city lord after all. Even if he was excited, he wouldn't lose his composure. He quickly controlled his emotions and said, Very few people can be as certain as Master Ren. He said, There are very few people like Teacher Ren who are so sure about this trip to the city. If everyone was like this, then Wisdom City wouldn't be in such a bad situation like it is now. Sigh. Luo Fan listened. He also sighed. Along the way, Luo Fan had a rough understanding of Wisdom City's situation, and he completely understood White Eye City Lord's meaning. In fact, among the thousands of cities that Luo Fan had visited, most of the city lords were similar in strength to the city lords of Hidden Tiger City and Bloody Battle City. Although most of the city lords were similar in strength to the city lords of Hidden Tiger City and Bloody Battle City, having only surpassed the Khanate Grand Luo realm, they hadn't reached the perished realm. Only a few city lords were above the perished realm. However, this didn't mean that, among the thousands of cities that he had visited, there were only a few hundred cultivators above the perished realm. On the contrary, the number of cultivators above the perished realm was many times more than what Luo Fan had imagined. Almost every city lord was above the perished realm, and the number of cultivators above the perished realm was counted in the hundreds or thousands. Even the weakest of them, the city lords, were cities above the perished realm. Among the living beings that survived, there were 300 to 400 who had surpassed the perished realm. The reason for this had already been explained back then. Not many living beings above the perished realm were willing to live in a city with a lower city lord than them, enduring the constant suppression of the sage decree. Hence, in the entire dream realm, however, living beings that had reached the perished realm would usually gather in cities with city lords above the perished realm. Hence, there were many living beings above the perished realm in these cities. They weren't just born in this city, but gathered from various cities in the entire dream realm. As for why these living beings above the perished realm didn't go to small cities, cities with city lords below the perished realm, to become city lords, the reason was simple. There were very few living beings that were willing to become city lords. This world was the dream realm of the intermediate sage-to-be. Everything here wasn't built according to the ideal state of the intermediate sage-to-be. But on the whole, it was still in line with the cultivation world that the intermediate sage-to-be had imagined. In the ideal world of cultivation, the most important thing for the cultivators was the improvement of their cultivation and cultivation realms, not the existence of power and influence. Hence, in this world, powerful cultivators didn't care much about power and influence. They were willing to waste their limited cultivation time for power and influence. The other city lords were above the perished realm, and there were many cultivators above the perished realm. However, in Wisdom Victory City, the city lord by Mu's cultivation realm was already at the peak of the Void Enlightening realm, which meant he was at the peak of the minor sage-to-be. Among the many cities that Luo Fan had passed by, he was considered one of the stronger ones. However, there were very few cultivators above the perished realm in this city. According to Luo Fan's senses, there were only a few dozen cultivators in the Annihilation realm and above in the entire city. Among these cultivators, most of them had just entered the Annihilation realm. In other words, they had just entered the Sage-to-be realm. The strongest among them was 1,000 times weaker than the White Eye City Lord. However, according to Luo Fan's senses, the aura they gave off was similar to that of the City Lord by Mu. He didn't need to think too much to know that these living beings were probably born in Wisdom Victory City. From this, it could be seen that although Wisdom Victory City was famous, it wasn't very attractive to powerful cultivators. After a sigh, Luo Fan said, "City Lord, don't overthink it. With such a huge library, Wisdom Victory City will one day become the strongest city in the world. Don't you have the confidence to do so?" The City Lord by Mu's expression turned solemn. "Our City Lords have always had the confidence to do so. I am no exception." When Luo Fan heard this, he chuckled and said, "If that's the case, isn't that good? Thank you for your advice, teacher. If not for you, I'm afraid I would have to search for a long time in the fog before I could think of such an obvious answer." The City Lord by Mu bowed to Luo Fan and thanked him. When Luo Fan saw this, he shook his head and chuckled. Ever since they had met, City Lord by Mu had been extremely humble. He had even analyzed every single word that Lin Fan had said, trying to find out what Lin Fan was looking for, and what Lin Fan wanted from Lin Fan. This attitude was similar to the attitude that Luo Fan had towards textbooks when he was studying on Earth in his previous life. He would analyze the meaning behind an article that even the original author would not have thought of. It was also because of this that the city lord Bai Mu paid more attention to Luo Fan's words, and thought more deeply about the words that Luo Fan had said. As a result, his emotions fluctuated greatly because of a few casual words from Luo Fan. The city lord Bai Mu's attitude was obviously created by Luo Fan over the past few thousand years. The title of human teacher was playing a huge role. In Luo Fan's opinion, this human teacher might not be much different from the title of Sage Confucius that he had heard of in his previous life. XXX. For the latest chapters, please log in. Reading is a pleasure. I suggest you bookmark it.